Welcome to Tales by Imon. Tonight, we peel back the layers of time, dust off a long-forgotten file, and step into the glittering, treacherous world of old Hollywood. We're not just telling a story, we're opening a cold case, one that has been shrouded in whispers and shadows for nearly a century. This is the story of a star who burned brighter than anyone, only to vanish into thin air. This is the cold case of the Silent Starlet. It all started, as these things so often do, with the ghosts of other people's lives. My name is Jake Harding, and I trade in those ghosts. I'm a true crime writer, which is a polite way of saying I spend my days sifting through the wreckage of the past, looking for stories that refuse to die. My office in downtown Los Angeles isn't glamorous. It's a cramped space smelling of old paper, stale coffee, and the faint, metallic scent of microfilm. It's a mausoleum of forgotten tragedies. The case of Elara Vance didn't land on my desk with a dramatic thud. There was no mysterious client in a fedora, no cryptic phone call in the dead of night. It came to me in a dusty cardboard box I bought for $50 at an estate sale in the San Fernando Valley. The sale was for the belongings of a retired LAPD detective, a man named Al Fincher, who had passed away at the ripe old age of 98. Most people were grabbing vintage furniture and old records. I went straight for the garage, where the real history lived. Tucked under a workbench, I found a box marked simply, Vance, Personal. I didn't think much of it at first. It could have been anything. But a $50 gamble on a cop's personal files? That's a bet I'll take every time. Back in my office, under the solitary glow of my desk lamp, I pried open the brittle flaps. The smell that hit me was the perfume of the past, dry, dusty, and potent. Inside was a meticulously organized, yet clearly unofficial, collection of files. These weren't official police documents, they were a cop's private obsession. There were yellowed newspaper clippings, the headlines screaming in bold, dramatic fonts. There were glossy 8x10 photographs, their corners softened with time. And there were handwritten notes, pages upon pages of Al Fincher's spidery, determined cursive. And at the very center of it all was her, Elara Vance. Even in the faded black and white photos, her presence was electric. She had a face that the camera wasn't just fond of, it was hopelessly in love with. Her eyes were large and dark, holding a universe of unspoken emotions, the very currency of a silent film star. Her mouth was a perfect Cupid's bow, often poised in a look of wistful melancholy that drove audiences wild. In the 1920s, they didn't call her a star, they called her the luminous ghost, a nickname she earned for her ethereal, almost translucent beauty on screen. She could make you weep with a single lingering glance. She was the queen of the silent era, poised on the precipice of even greater fame as the talkies began to roar. And then, on the night of November 7th, 1928, she vanished. I leaned back in my chair, the leather groaning in protest. I knew the basics of the Elara Vance story, of course. Every true crime aficionado in LA does. It's one of the city's great, unsolved myths. She disappeared from her sprawling Spanish-style mansion in the Hollywood Hills on the night of the premiere of her biggest film, The Gilded Cage. The papers at the time had a field day. There were no signs of a struggle. No forced entry. Her silk evening gown was laid out on her bed, a string of pearls coiled beside it. A half-finished glass of champagne sat on her vanity. It was as if she had simply evaporated. The police were stumped. They interviewed everyone, her domineering studio boss, a man named Silas Blackwood who practically owned half of Hollywood, her co-star and rumored lover, the handsome but notoriously volatile Marco Sterling, her fiercely jealous rival, a vampish actress named Serafina Monroe. They all had alibis, some stronger than others, but nothing concrete ever stuck. The investigation generated thousands of pages of reports, fueled endless speculation, and ultimately went cold. Elara Vance, the luminous ghost, became a ghost for real. But what I had in this box was different. This wasn't the public record. This was Detective Al Fincher's life's work. Fincher was a rookie back in 28, one of the first officers on the scene. The case clearly got under his skin and never let go. 4 decades after his retirement, he kept digging. I spent the next few hours lost in his world. I read his notes, his theories. He'd re-interviewed witnesses 30, even 40 years after the fact. He'd sketched out timelines and relationship maps that were dizzyingly complex. He believed the official investigation had been compromised from the start. Too much power, too much money, he wrote in one note dated 1965. Blackwood owned the mayor, and the mayor owned the chief. They wanted it gone. They wanted her gone. This was the hook. The hint of a conspiracy, a cover-up. The official story was a mystery. Fincher's private file suggested something far darker. I picked up one of the photographs. It was a candid shot, not a studio portrait. Elara was on a film set, laughing. It was a genuine, unguarded laugh, and it transformed her face. The melancholy luminous ghost was gone, replaced by a vibrant, living woman. She wasn't looking at the camera. She was looking at someone off to the side, someone who had clearly brought her immense joy. I flipped the photo over. Scrawled on the back in Fincher's hand was a single word. Julian? The name wasn't anywhere in the official case files I was familiar with. It wasn't her co-star, her director, or her studio boss. Who was Julian? Deeper in the box, tucked inside a manila envelope labeled Anomalies, I found it. It was a small, sealed evidence bag. Inside wasn't a weapon or a piece of jewelry. It was a single, pressed gardenia, its petals now a brittle, translucent brown. A note from Fincher was stapled to the bag. Found under the floorboards of the dressing room. Her private bungalow on the studio lot. Smelled it during a final sweep, a year after she vanished. The scent was still there. Faint. But it was hers. She always wore them. A flower, hidden beneath the floorboards. It was a piece of the puzzle that had never seen the light of day. Why hide a flower? Was it a memento? A message? My heart began to beat a little faster. This wasn't just an old story anymore. This was a trail. Faint, cold, and nearly a century old, but a trail nonetheless. The box wasn't just a collection of a dead cop's memories. It was a map. Al Fincher had left behind a breadcrumb trail, and I was the first person to find it. I looked around my quiet office, at the stacks of files from other cases, other tragedies. They suddenly seemed to fade into the background. In the center of my desk, under the stark light, the ghost of Elara Vance was beginning to take shape. She wasn't just a headline or a myth anymore. She was a woman who laughed, who loved a man named Julian, who hid flowers under her floorboards. A woman whose story was waiting, desperately, to be told. And as the city lights of Los Angeles began to flicker on outside my window, I knew with absolute certainty that I was the one who was going to tell it. The Silent Starlet was about to find her voice. The city outside my window hummed with a life that had no memory of Elara Vance, but in my office, she was all that mattered. The discovery of the name Julian and the hidden gardenia had changed everything. The case was no longer a static piece of history. It was a living, breathing mystery, and for the first time in 90-some years, it had a pulse. My night was a blur of caffeine and obsession. With Detective Fincher's box as my guide, I dove headfirst into the digital rabbit hole, hoping to drag a ghost from the 1920s into the light of my monitor. My first search was a simple one, Elara Vance Julian. The results were a digital shrug. Nothing. Pages of articles about her disappearance, her films, her co-star Marco Sterling, her boss Silas Blackwood. But no Julian. I tried every variation I could think of, Julian friend, Julian crew, Julian lover. Each query hit a brick wall. It was as if this person, so important that a career detective scribbled his name on the back of a cherished photograph, had been completely erased from her public story. This, I knew, was significant. In the meticulously crafted world of a Hollywood star, especially one under the iron thumb of a studio like Blackwood's, anonymity was either a privilege or a threat. If Julian was part of Elara's life, their relationship was a secret. And in old Hollywood, secrets were currency, and they were dangerous. Fincher's notes confirmed my suspicions. He'd hit the same wall decades earlier, long before the internet. He'd manually scoured studio payrolls, casting sheets, and employee records. I saw his frustrated scribbles in the margins. No Julian on payroll. Not an actor. Not a director. A ghost. But I had an advantage Fincher didn't. I had digitized archives. My next stop was the Academy's Margaret Herrick Library online portal. I spent hours sifting through production records for The Gilded Cage. I scanned through lists of cameramen, grips, set designers, costume assistants, a veritable army of people who worked in the shadows to make the stars shine. The name Julian was nowhere. It was maddening. I felt a kinship with old Al Fincher, staring at the same dead end he did, separated only by time and technology. By dawn, my eyes were burning, and the coffee had turned bitter on my tongue. I was about to give up for the night when an idea sparked. I had been searching for an employee. But what if Julian wasn't on the payroll for that specific film? What if he was a more permanent fixture? I broadened my search to the studio's general staff for the entire year of 1928. And there he was. The name jumped out at me from a scanned ledger of the studio's music department. Croft, Julian. Title, Staff Composer. He wasn't a big-shot film scorer. His name was listed among the people who wrote incidental music, transitional cues, the subtle emotional fabric of silent films. He was a background player, a creator of moods, an artist hiding in plain sight. My fingers flew across the keyboard. Julian Croft. This time, I got a hit. Just one. A single low-resolution photograph from a 1927 issue of a long-defunct industry magazine called Silver Screen Tones. The photo was from a studio holiday party, and it was a gut punch. There, standing slightly apart from the crowd, was Elara Vance. She wasn't posing. She wasn't the luminous ghost. She was just a woman, a radiant smile on her face, the same one from Fincher's private photo. Her gaze was directed at a young man standing beside a piano. He was handsome in a quiet, unassuming way, with dark, thoughtful eyes and a slightly shy smile. He was holding a sheet of music, but his attention was entirely on her. It was a stolen moment of pure, unscripted connection, captured by chance. The caption beneath the photo was generic: Starlet Elara Vance enjoys a tune at the annual studio gala. But the man at the piano wasn't named. He was just part of the background. But I knew who he was. It was Julian Croft. And pinned to the lapel of his simple suit jacket was a single white flower. A gardenia. The room felt silent, electric. The flower wasn't just Elara's signature scent. It was their signature. A symbol of a love story hidden from the world. A composer and his muse. A secret kept from the jealous co-stars, the possessive studio heads, and the rabid press. This changed the entire dynamic of her disappearance. This wasn't just a star vanishing. It was one half of a secret couple vanishing. Now, the crucial question: what happened to Julian Croft? The answer was both illuminating and chilling. I found his studio employment record. His contract was terminated on November 9, 1928, 2 days after Elara disappeared. The official reason was listed as breach of contract, job abandonment. He too had vanished. Did they run away together? It was the romantic theory, the one the police likely dismissed early on. A star at her peak doesn't throw it all away for a staff composer without leaving a trace. There would have been a financial trail, a whispered goodbye to a trusted friend. But there was nothing. Their disappearance was too clean, too absolute. I dug deeper into Julian's life. He was from a small town in Ohio. He'd come to Hollywood with dreams of composing great film scores, but had found himself toiling in the studio's music factory. He was talented but not ambitious, according to a brief bio in the studio magazine. A quiet man in a loud town. My search for his life after 1928 took me to public records, census data, property deeds, old phone directories. It was a slow, painstaking process. And then I found it. An obituary, not from Los Angeles, but from a small-town newspaper, the Ashtabula County Chronicle, dated June 1978. Julian R. Croft, 74, passed away peacefully at his home. Mr. Croft, a one-time musician in California, returned to Ohio in late 1928 and lived a quiet life as a local piano teacher. He was known for his love of gardening and his reserved nature. He hadn't vanished forever. He had simply run. He ran from Hollywood, from his career, from the entire world he had shared with Elara Vance, and buried himself in quiet obscurity for 50 years. He lived half a century after the woman he loved disappeared. He never went back. He never spoke out. He just existed. Why? If they had a plan to run away together, why did he go alone? If he knew what happened to her, why did he stay silent for 50 years? Was it fear, guilt, or something else entirely? He took his secrets to the grave. I read the final lines of the short obituary, my mind racing. He was preceded in death by his parents. He leaves no direct descendants. For a moment, my heart sank. The trail had gone cold again. But then I saw the last 3 words. Survived by one niece. The obituary didn't give her name, but it was a lead. A huge one. A living link to Julian Croft. A person who might have known him, might have heard stories, might even have a box of old letters or a diary stored in an attic. She was the keeper of his 50 years of silence. Finding an unnamed niece of a man who died decades ago would be a challenge. But it wasn't impossible. The ghost of Julian Croft had led me out of Hollywood and pointed me toward the quiet fields of Ohio. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I had to follow. The distance between Los Angeles, 1928, and Ashtabula, Ohio, 1978, felt immense, a chasm of 50 years filled with one man's silence. My path forward was clear, but it wasn't glamorous. There would be no high-speed chases or shadowy informants in trench coats. My hunt for Julian Croft's niece would be a quiet, meticulous excavation of public records. It was the grunt work of my profession, the slow, patient sifting of data in search of a single, crucial connection. My first step was to build a family tree for Julian Croft. Using genealogy databases, I pulled up his birth certificate from 1904. Parents, Walter and Agnes Croft. The 1920 census showed the family living on a small farm, and it listed a second child, a daughter named Clara, 3 years younger than Julian. This had to be her, the future mother of the niece mentioned in the obituary. The digital breadcrumbs started to form a trail. I found a marriage license for Clara Croft, dated 1925. She had married a local man named George Peterson. Now I had a new family name to follow. The next piece of the puzzle was the most important, finding their children. I focused my search on birth records in Ashtabula County between 1925 and 1945. For an hour, I found nothing but other Petersons, other families living out their quiet lives. My initial surge of adrenaline was fading, replaced by the familiar, grinding patience of the job. And then, I found her. A birth certificate issued in 1940. The name on the document was Eleanor Grace Peterson. Parents, George Peterson and Clara Croft Peterson. Eleanor. The name felt like a faint, haunting echo of Elara. A coincidence, surely, but a poignant one. It was a link, a fragile thread stretching from a grieving sister to the memory of a lost love. Now I had a name. But a name from 1940 isn't a guarantee of a living person today. Eleanor Peterson would be in her 80s. The search moved from the past to the present. I shifted from genealogy sites to modern people finder databases and online white pages. I typed in the name, the location, and held my breath. The result came back almost instantly. One listing. E. Peterson. Address on a quiet, tree-lined street in Ashtabula, Ohio. The same town where Julian had lived out his last 50 years. A landline phone number was attached. It felt too easy, almost like a trap. But sometimes the simplest path is the right one. I stared at the phone number on my screen for a long time. This was the moment of truth. My investigation so far had been a conversation with ghosts and documents. Now, I had to speak to the living. This single phone call could either slam the door on the entire case or blow it wide open. Eleanor Peterson was the sole guardian of her uncle's secrets. She might know everything, or she might know nothing at all. She might be a lonely old woman eager to talk, or she could be fiercely protective of her family's privacy and hang up on me the second I said my name. My hand hesitated over the phone. I thought of Julian Croft, living out his life in self-imposed exile. What was he running from? What did he carry inside him for all those years? Was it the grief of losing the love of his life? Or the guilt of knowing what happened to her? The only person left on Earth who might know was on the other end of this phone number. I took a deep breath, pushed aside the doubt, and dialed. The phone rang 3 times, each ring stretching into an eternity. I was about to hang up when a voice answered, thin and reedy, like the rustle of dry leaves. Hello. Hello, I began, trying to keep my voice calm and professional. Am I speaking with Eleanor Peterson? There was a cautious pause. Who is asking? My name is Jake Harding. I'm a writer from Los Angeles. I know this is an unusual call, but I was hoping you might be able to help me with some historical research. I'm writing a book about the old Hollywood studio system, specifically about the artists who worked behind the scenes. It was a partial truth, the easiest way in. Hollywood, she said, the word sounding foreign and distant. That was a long time ago. I don't know what I could tell you. She sounded tired, ready to end the call. I had to act fast. I believe your uncle, Julian Croft, worked as a composer for a major studio back in the 1920s, I said, gently laying my cards on the table. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't weary, it was sharp, attentive. My uncle Julian. Yes, he did. For a very short time. That's right, I continued, pressing my advantage. I'm particularly interested in the last film he may have worked on. It was a picture called The Gilded Cage. I could almost feel the temperature on the line drop. I see, she said, her voice now stripped of its frailty, replaced by a guarded intelligence. And why, Mr. Harding, would a writer from Los Angeles be interested in my uncle's brief time at that studio? This was it. No more half-truths. I had to mention the name. I had to say her name. Because the star of that film was a woman named Elara Vance, I said, my voice low. And my research suggests that she and your uncle were close. Another silence. This one was longer, deeper. It was the sound of a lock turning, of a long-sealed door groaning open an inch. I pictured her in a quiet house in Ohio, the receiver pressed to her ear, a lifetime of unspoken family history rushing back into the room. When she finally spoke, Her voice was barely a whisper. Elara Vance. Goodness. That is a name I have not heard spoken aloud in many, many years. My heart hammered in my chest. She didn't deny it. She didn't feign ignorance. She acknowledged the name, and in doing so, she acknowledged the connection. Miss Peterson, I said, my own voice hushed with anticipation. I believe your uncle's story is crucial to understanding what really happened to her. I know this is a lot to ask, but I would be willing to fly to Ohio. I would be honored to sit down with you and hear whatever you're willing to share. I waited, expecting her to refuse, expecting the door to slam shut. But Julian Croft's 50 years of silence had to end somewhere. Perhaps she knew it, too. You would come all the way out here, she asked, a note of disbelief in her voice. Without hesitation, I confirmed. She was quiet for another moment, and I could hear the faint ticking of a clock in the background, marking the seconds across a century of secrets. Very well, Mr. Harding, she said, her voice firm now, resolved. You come to Ohio. We will talk. We set a time, 2 days from now. I scribbled down her address as she recited it. After we hung up, I sat in the profound silence of my office, the hum of the city outside seeming miles away. The case had a voice now. An elderly woman in a small town, the last living link to a love story that ended in tragedy. I pulled up an airline website on my computer. I wasn't just chasing a ghost anymore. I was chasing a memory, one that had been carefully guarded for decades. My next stop wasn't a dusty archive or a library. It was a small house on a quiet street in Ashtabula, Ohio, where the Silent Starlet story might finally be ready to be heard. The flight from Los Angeles to Cleveland was a journey through time and geography. Below me, the sun-scorched, sprawling grid of Southern California, a landscape of dreams and concrete, gave way to the patchwork quilts of Midwestern farmland. I was leaving the city where Elara Vance had been manufactured into a goddess and flying toward the place where the man who loved her had chosen to become a ghost. With every passing mile, the glamour of Hollywood felt more and more like a fever dream, and the quiet reality of a small Ohio town felt more and more like the truth. Ashtabula in person was exactly as I had pictured it, a town settled deep in its own history. The houses were old, proud, and set back from the streets. The air was clean and smelled of damp earth and cut grass. It was the kind of place where a secret could be kept, where a man could disappear into the rhythm of the seasons and let the world forget him. Eleanor Peterson lived in a small, tidy bungalow with a wide front porch and a garden where late summer roses were still stubbornly in bloom. As I walked up the cracked concrete path, I felt a wave of nervous energy. I was about to knock on the door of the past. The woman on the other side was not just a witness. She was a curator of a memory, the last living person to have stood in the shadow of this tragedy. The door opened before I could knock. Eleanor Peterson was smaller than I'd imagined, her frame made delicate by age, but her eyes, a pale, clear blue, were sharp and missed nothing. She assessed me in a single, sweeping glance. Mr. Harding, she said, her voice the same reedy instrument from the phone call. You're punctual. Come in. She led me into a living room that was immaculate and still. It was a museum of a quiet life, dark wood furniture polished to a soft gleam, a grandfather clock ticking solemnly in the corner, and walls adorned with framed, faded photographs of people I didn't know. It was the kind of room where loud noises felt like a transgression. She gestured for me to sit in an armchair and disappeared into the kitchen, returning a few moments later with a tray bearing 2 cups of tea and a plate of shortbread cookies. The ritual was disarming, a deliberate slowing of time before we addressed the reason for my journey. My mother, Clara, was Julian's sister, she began, sitting opposite me. She adored her brother. When he came back from California at the end of 1928, he was a different man. The light had gone out of his eyes. He never spoke of his time there. Not once. But my mother knew. He had told her everything in his letters before it all went wrong. She took a slow sip of her tea, her gaze distant. You were right, Mr. Harding. My uncle and Miss Vance, they were in love. Terribly in love. From what my mother told me, Hollywood was a prison for her. A beautiful, gilded cage, she said, unknowingly echoing the title of Elara's final film. The studio owned her. The director controlled her. The public consumed her. Julian was the only part of her life that was real. He didn't want anything from her. He just saw her. This confirmed everything I suspected, but the real revelation was yet to come. They had a plan, Eleanor said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. It was all arranged. Elara was tired of the artifice, and she was terrified of the studio head, Mr. Blackwood. He was possessive. She knew he would never let her go, and she knew the coming of sound films would change everything. She wanted out. So she and Julian planned for her to disappear. My pen froze above my notepad. A planned disappearance? Exactly, Eleanor confirmed. The night of her premiere, after the initial excitement died down, she was going to slip away. She had a car waiting a few blocks from her mansion. She was to drive to a small town in Arizona where Julian would be waiting. They had money saved, money she had been secretly pulling out of her accounts for months. They were going to start over. New names, a new life. No more luminous ghost. Just Elara and Julian. The official story, the one that had baffled police for decades, was a lie. A carefully constructed piece of theater. The Vanishing Act was the final and greatest performance of Elara Vance's career. But she never arrived, I said, the pieces clicking into place. Eleanor shook her head, a deep sadness settling on her features. Julian waited for 3 days in that dusty little town. He heard the news on the radio. Starlet vanishes. It was a sensation. At first, he thought it was part of the plan, that the media frenzy would help cover their tracks. But when she didn't show up, he began to panic. He tried to call a trusted friend of hers back in LA, but the line was dead. He was alone, cut off and terrified. What did he think happened? I asked. He believed Silas Blackwood found out, she said, her voice trembling slightly. He was convinced Blackwood discovered their plan and intercepted her. Julian was just a staff composer. Blackwood was one of the most powerful men in California. Julian believed with all his soul that Blackwood had murdered her to stop her from leaving, and then used his influence with the police to make the whole investigation go nowhere. He thought if he went back, if he said a word, Blackwood's men would find him and put him in the ground right next to her. So Julian's 50 years of silence wasn't born of guilt. It was born of sheer, paralyzing terror. He hadn't abandoned Elara, he had been robbed of her. He ran back to Ohio to save his own life, and lived in the shadow of that fear until the day he died. Before he passed, Eleanor continued, he gave my mother a small box. He told her it held things he couldn't bear to look at, but couldn't bring himself to destroy. After my mother died, it came to me. She rose slowly and walked to a wooden chest in the corner of the room. She retrieved a small, simple box of cedar wood, its surface smooth with age, and placed it on the coffee table between us. He never told my mother what was inside. I think maybe he would want you to have it. My hands trembled slightly as I lifted the lid. The box smelled faintly of gardenias. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, were a handful of letters, their envelopes tied with a silk ribbon. There was also a single, dried gardenia, perfectly preserved. But it was the last two items that made my breath catch in my throat. One was a small, ornate, brass key. It was a skeleton key, but for what, I had no idea. The other was a piece of paper, folded into a tiny square. I carefully unfolded it. It was a hand-drawn map, sketched in dark ink. It wasn't a map to Arizona. It was a map of a single intersection in Los Angeles, an area I recognized as being near the old downtown banking district. An X marked a spot on a corner, with a time written beside it, 11 p.m. This must have been a contingency plan. A backup meeting place. A key and a map. Tangible clues from a ghost. I looked up at Eleanor, my mind reeling. Did he know what these were for? I don't think so, she whispered. I think they were her part of the plan. The things he was supposed to receive when they met. When she never came, they just became mysteries. Riddles he was too afraid to solve. I left Eleanor Peterson's house with the cedar box clutched in my hands. The case had been completely redefined. Elara Vance wasn't a victim of a random kidnapping. She was an escape artist whose final trick had failed. And Silas Blackwood wasn't just a domineering boss. He was now my prime suspect for a murder that had been hidden for nearly a century. On the flight back to LA, I wasn't just carrying a dead man's mementos. I was carrying a key. And I was returning to the City of Angels to find the lock it was meant to open. Los Angeles looked different when I landed. The familiar haze hanging over the city seemed less like atmosphere and more like a shroud. The old Art Deco buildings downtown no longer looked like charming relics. They looked like silent witnesses. I had left chasing the ghost of a victim, but I returned hunting the shadow of a killer. The city was no longer just a setting. It was an active crime scene, 90-some years cold. Back in the familiar clutter of my office, I cleared my desk, creating a sterile space in the chaos. I carefully placed the contents of the cedar box under the stark glow of my lamp. The dried gardenia, a fragile testament to a lost love, the ornate brass key, heavy with potential, the hand-drawn map, a final, desperate plan, and the bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. The letters were my first priority. They were my only chance to hear Elara's voice, to read her own words. My hands were surprisingly steady as I untied the ribbon. The paper was brittle, and her handwriting was a delicate, looping script, full of elegant flourishes. I started with the earliest one. It was a love letter, pure and simple, filled with the breathless joy of a secret discovery. "My dearest Julian," she wrote, "the music you played for me today, it was the sound of my own heart, a melody I thought I had forgotten. When I am with you, the noise of this place, the cameras, the lights, Mr. Blackwood's constant, watching eyes, it all fades to a hum. You are my quiet place. You are my truth." As I read on, the tone of the letters began to shift. Her love for Julian remained a fierce, bright flame, but the shadows around it grew longer and darker. She wrote more and more about Silas Blackwood. "He speaks of my career as if it is a thing he constructed, a machine he owns. And I suppose, in a way, he is right. He found me, he molded me, and he will not let me go. Today he gifted me a pearl necklace. It felt less like a gift and more like a collar. He said, 'A star belongs in the sky, Elara, where everyone can see her.' He does not understand that I would rather be a wildflower in an open field, seen only by you." The fear in her words was palpable. Blackwood wasn't just a boss, he was a warden. Her fame was her prison. This confirmed everything Eleanor had told me. The escape plan wasn't a whim, it was a desperate act of self-preservation. The final letter, dated just a week before her disappearance, laid it all out. "It is all arranged, my love. The money is ready. The car is hidden. After the premiere, the world will be looking for the luminous ghost, but she will be gone forever. I will be on my way to Arizona, on my way to you. If, by some terrible chance, something goes wrong, meet me at the place on the map. Midnight. Don't be late. Everything we need will be there. We will finally be free. The place on the map." I set the letter down and picked up the small, hand-drawn sketch. It was simple, 2 intersecting streets, a building on one corner marked with a prominent X. The handwriting labeling the streets was Elara's. Spring Street and 6th Street. My heart quickened. That was the heart of the old financial district. I turned to my computer, my fingers flying across the keyboard, searching through digitized historical archives of Los Angeles. I needed to know what buildings stood on that corner in 1928. I pulled up old city directories and finally, a detailed 1920s-based insurance map. There it was, in crisp, clear lettering, labeling the grand pillared building on that exact corner, Pacific Trust and Savings Bank. The key, the map, a bank. It all clicked into place with the force of a physical blow. The key wasn't for a house or a car. It was for a safe deposit box. That was her final contingency. She had secured a safe deposit box, a place outside of Blackwood's control, to hold the essentials for her new life, the bulk of her cash, perhaps fake identity papers, deeds, anything she needed to disappear and start over. The 11 p.m. time on the map was a typo in her last letter, or maybe just a misremembered detail. Midnight was the true meeting time. This was her fail-safe. If the initial plan to drive straight out of town failed, she would go to the bank, retrieve her escape kit, and wait for Julian. But she never made it. Somewhere between her Hollywood mansion and that bank on Spring Street, Silas Blackwood had stopped her. The Pacific Trust and Savings Bank, of course, no longer existed. A bank that prominent wouldn't just vanish. It would have been bought, sold, and merged over the decades, swallowed by bigger fish in the corporate sea. The next phase of my investigation was clear. I had to trace the lineage of that bank, through 90 years of acquisitions and rebranding, to find out which modern institution held its records and, more importantly, its old vaults. It took another full day of tedious research, tracing a tangled web of corporate history. Pacific Trust was acquired by California Mutual in the 40s. California Mutual merged with SunWest Bancorp in the 70s. And finally, in a massive deal in the late 90s, SunWest was absorbed by a modern, soulless global banking giant, Omnibank. The trail ended at one of the largest financial institutions in the world. My next step was a daunting one. I had to convince a multi-billion-dollar corporation to grant me access to a nearly century-old, abandoned safe deposit box. A box that was technically still the property of a woman who had been legally declared dead for over 80 years. I had no court order, no legal standing. All I had was a strange brass key and a story that sounded like a work of fiction. I looked at the phone, then at Omnibank's labyrinthine website. This wasn't a problem I could solve with a simple phone call. I would have to navigate a corporate fortress of legal departments, records management, and compliance officers who were paid handsomely to say no. I picked up the key, its metal cool against my palm. This small object was the last will and testament of Elara Vance. It was the physical manifestation of her hope for a different life. For decades, it had lain dormant in a box in Ohio. Now, it was in my hand. The lock it belonged to was somewhere in the deep, forgotten vaults of Omnibank, a modern tomb for old secrets. I took a deep breath and found the number for Omnibank's corporate headquarters. The journey to Ohio felt like a simple walk in the park compared to the mountain of bureaucracy I was about to climb. The robotic voice of the automated phone system answered on the first ring. "Thank you for calling Omnibank," it chirped, its voice devoid of any humanity. "For account services, please press 1. The hunt was on. The days that followed were a masterclass in corporate indifference. My initial attempts to contact Omnibank were like shouting into a void. I spent hours navigating their automated phone system, a digital labyrinth designed to exhaust and defeat any inquiry that didn't involve a 16-digit account number. When I did manage to reach a human being in a distant call center, my request was met with a polite but firm bewilderment. "A safe deposit box from 1928, one customer service representative asked, her voice a mixture of confusion and pity. "Sir, our digital records only go back to 1982. There's nothing I can do." I was transferred to records management, who told me I needed to speak to the legal department. The legal department's paralegal told me that without a court order and proof of executorship for the estate of Elara Vance, they couldn't even acknowledge the existence of such a box. I was trapped in a perfectly constructed bureaucratic loop. My emails to their generic corporate addresses were answered with automated replies promising a response within 5 to 7 business days, a response that never came. Detective Fincher had faced a wall of silence built by power and influence. I was facing a wall of silence built by policy and apathy. I wasn't sure which was worse. Frustrated, I knew I needed a different approach. A frontal assault was useless. I needed to find a side door. I started digging into Omnibank itself, not as a customer, but as a historian. I searched for articles, press releases, and academic papers about its history and the various banks it had absorbed over the century. I was looking for a name. Not a CEO or a board member, but someone who cared about the past. Someone whose job it was to remember what the corporation was so eager to forget. After 2 days of deep diving into obscure financial journals and archived news sites, I found him. Arthur Pinter. His name appeared in a 2015 article celebrating the 100-year anniversary of a building that had once housed a bank Omnibank now owned. His title was Director of Corporate Archives and Heritage. He was, in essence, the company's official memory keeper. He was my side door. Finding his direct contact information wasn't easy, but writers who investigate cold cases learn how to be resourceful. I found an old staff directory on a university library website where he had once given a guest lecture. I took a chance and sent an email, bypassing the corporate gatekeepers entirely. I didn't frame it as a demand. I framed it as an appeal from one historian to another. I told him the story of Elara Vance, of Julian Croft, of the key and the map. I attached a scan of the key and the hand-drawn map. I wasn't asking for access. I was asking if the story was even possible. I didn't expect a reply. 24 hours later, my phone rang. The number was from a private exchange. "Mr. Harding, this is Arthur Pinter." His voice was dry and precise, the voice of a man who spends his days with documents. "I received your email. It is, without a doubt, the most interesting inquiry to cross my desk in the last decade." I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. "Thank you for calling me back, Mr. Pinter." "Let me be clear," he said, his tone professional but not unkind. "What you're asking for is next to impossible. The legal hurdles are monumental. However, your theory is not incorrect. When Pacific Trust and Savings was acquired, the contents of its vaults, including all dormant and unclaimed safe deposit boxes, were not discarded. They were absorbed. They were cataloged, transported, and placed in what we call deep archival storage. It's a climate-controlled facility in a secure, undisclosed location. A tomb, for all intents and purposes. So it could still be there, I said, a surge of adrenaline cutting through my frustration. It could, he stressed. Finding it would be another matter. We're talking about millions of legacy assets. But the key you sent a picture of, it's a model from the era. And the Pacific Trust branch on Spring Street was their flagship location. They used a very specific brand of lock. It's plausible. He paused, and I could hear the faint rustle of papers on his end. Here is the problem, Mr. Harding. No one will help you. The bank's legal team is designed to mitigate risk, and you are pure risk. But... He paused again, and I sensed he was taking a chance. There is a process for historical and academic inquiries. It is rarely used and widely ignored, but it exists. This was it. The crack in the wall. I cannot act on your behalf, Arthur said sternly. Doing so would be a breach of my employment contract. But I can offer you some unofficial guidance. You need to draft a formal letter of inquiry. It must be addressed directly to the General Counsel's office. In it, you must lay out the case clearly and concisely. Emphasize the historical significance of the subject, Elara Vance. Mention her legal status, declared deceased, estate long since dissolved with no living heirs. This makes it unclaimed property, which falls under a different set of state regulations. He continued, giving me a verbal roadmap through the minefield. Reference the California unclaimed property law. Argue that the contents are not of monetary value but of significant historical and cultural importance. That's the key phrase. It moves the request from a financial claim to a cultural one. I will make sure that your letter doesn't get lost in the shuffle. I can't promise anything more. It was more than I could have ever hoped for. Arthur Pinter was the ghost in the machine, the one person in that entire global corporation who saw the contents of his archives as stories, not just assets. After I hung up, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. I spent the rest of the day and most of the night drafting the letter. It was the most important piece of writing I had ever done. I wrote and rewrote every sentence, honing the argument, weaving the tragic story of Elara Vance with the dry, legalistic language Arthur had suggested. I laid out the evidence, the connection to Julian Croft, the probable link to Silas Blackwood, and the box's potential to finally solve one of Los Angeles's oldest and most romanticized mysteries. I attached scans of the key, the map, and one of Elara's heartbreaking letters to Julian. I wanted the lawyers who read it to see not just a case file, but a human tragedy. Finally, just before midnight, it was done. The letter was a carefully constructed missile of history, law, and human emotion, aimed at the heart of an unfeeling corporate giant. I attached it to a new email, addressed it to the General Counsel as instructed, and hovered my finger over the send button. I hit send. The email vanished into the digital ether. I had done everything Arthur Pinter had advised. I had fired my shot. Now, all I could do was wait for the giant to stir. The silence that followed the sending of my letter was a heavy, suffocating thing. In my line of work, I'm used to waiting. Waiting for a source to call back, for a public record to be released, for a piece of the puzzle to surface from the depths of the past. But this was different. I was waiting on the whim of a faceless corporate entity, a modern-day dragon guarding a century of treasure and trash with equal indifference. Every ping of an incoming email made my shoulders tense. Every phone call from an unknown number made my heart jump. But the days bled into a week, and the only replies I received were for things that didn't matter. The dragon, it seemed, was sleeping. I couldn't let the investigation stall. An investigator who only pursues one lead at a time is an investigator who fails. While one door remained closed, I had to start knocking on another. My focus shifted from Elara's escape to the man who most likely stopped it, Silas Blackwood. Blackwood was long dead, having passed away from a heart attack on his lavish Bel Air estate in 1957. He died a titan, a celebrated pioneer of the cinematic arts. His public legacy was pristine. But I wasn't interested in the public legacy. I was interested in the monster he was in private. I went back to the one source I knew I could trust, Detective Al Fincher's box. Fincher, it turned out, was obsessed with Blackwood. The box was littered with notes about him, scraps of unofficial interviews, and dead-end leads that the official investigation had never bothered to pursue. One note, scribbled on a cocktail napkin, was particularly chilling. It was from a 1962 follow-up Fincher had done on his own time. Spoke to Agnes P., former maid at Blackwood Estate, 1927 to 1930. Terrified to talk, even after all these years. Said SB had a fearsome temper. Would smash things. Had a study in the basement he had soundproofed. Said Mrs. Blackwood was a ghost in her own house, walked on eggshells. Agnes was on duty the night Vance disappeared. SB and his wife were home. That was his alibi. Agnes said Mrs. Blackwood's eyes were puffy and red the next morning. When I asked if they'd been fighting, Agnes clammed up. Said, some things are better left buried. She wouldn't say another word. A soundproofed study. A terrified wife providing an alibi. It wasn't proof of anything, but it painted a picture of a man who ruled his home with fear, a man capable of terrible rage behind a veneer of civility. I spent the next few days building on Fincher's foundation. I scoured the archives of old Hollywood gossip columns, the rags that traded in the whispers the major papers wouldn't print. The language was coded, full of blind items to avoid lawsuits, but the picture was clear. Blackwood was notorious for his possessiveness. One column from 1927 referred to a certain studio mogul, who keeps his prettiest star on a golden leash, reminding her that he made her, and he can just as easily unmake her. Another spoke of Elara Vance's melancholy beauty, speculating that her sadness wasn't just for the cameras. I read biographies of other actors from his studio. Most spoke of him with a kind of fearful reverence. He was a genius, a visionary, a king. But reading between the lines, the truth was there. He controlled every aspect of his stars' lives, who they dated, what they wore, where they were seen. They weren't artists to him, they were assets, investments. And Elara Vance was his prized possession. Her plan to run away with Julian Croft wasn't just an employee quitting her job. In the mind of a malignant narcissist like Silas Blackwood, it would have been the ultimate theft. She wasn't just leaving him, she was stealing herself from him. That was a betrayal he would never have allowed. He wouldn't have just been angry, he would have been incandescent with rage. The soundproof study in his basement suddenly took on a horrifying new significance. On the 8th day of silence from the bank, my phone finally rang. The caller ID read, Omnibank Corporate. My breath caught. Jake Harding, I answered, keeping my voice as level as I could. Mr. Harding, this is Catherine Davies from the Office of the General Counsel at Omnibank. Her voice was young, sharp, and utterly devoid of warmth. It was the voice of a lawyer who bills in 6-minute increments. I'm calling regarding your letter of inquiry dated August 15th. Yes, Ms. Davies, I said. Your request is, to put it mildly, highly irregular, she began, and I could hear the rustle of my letter on her end. Our protocols regarding dormant assets are quite clear. Access is restricted to court-appointed estate executors or via direct judicial order. You have provided neither. My stomach sank. Here it comes, I thought. The final no. However, she continued, and that one word changed everything. Your argument regarding the potential historical and cultural value of the asset, coupled with the subject's unique legal status, has been reviewed. My department has consulted with our chief archivist, Mr. Pinter, who has corroborated the potential significance. Arthur, you magnificent man, I thought. He hadn't just passed the letter on, he had championed it. Under a rarely used provision for assets of potential public interest, we are prepared to grant you a one-time, supervised access to the asset in question, should it be located. I almost dropped the phone. That's incredible news. This is not a simple matter, Mr. Harding, she cautioned, her tone sharpening again. There are conditions. You will be required to sign a non-disclosure agreement pertaining to all Omnibank procedures and the location of our archival facility. Access will be granted at this facility only at a time of our choosing. You will be escorted at all times. The box will be opened in the presence of myself and a member of our security team. Is that understood? Perfectly, I said, my mind racing. Very well. Be at this address tomorrow at 2 p.m. sharp. She recited the address of a nondescript building in an industrial park out in the Inland Empire. Bring the key. And Mr. Harding, do not be late. The line went dead. I leaned back in my chair, a slow grin spreading across my face. I had done it. I had stared down the dragon, and it had blinked. I picked up the small brass key from my desk. For weeks it had been a symbol of a lost hope, a riddle with no answer. Now it was a tool, a promise. In less than 24 hours, I was going to turn that key in a lock that hadn't been opened since 1928. I wasn't just going to a storage facility. I was going to a rendezvous with Elara Vance, nearly a century too late. And I had a feeling that whatever she had left behind was going to blow this cold case wide open. The drive out to the Inland Empire felt like crossing into another country. The glamour and myth of Los Angeles peeled away with every mile, replaced by the stark, sun-bleached reality of warehouses, industrial parks, and endless stretches of asphalt shimmering in the heat. This was the unglamorous back office of the Dream Factory, the place where things are stored, managed, and forgotten. It was the perfect place to hide a secret for a century. The address Catherine Davies had given me was for a building that was deliberately anonymous. It was a massive, windowless block of gray concrete, surrounded by a high fence topped with security cameras. There was no sign, no corporate logo. It could have been anything, and that was the point. This was Omnibank's memory vault, a corporate tomb where history was catalogued and buried. I was met at the gate by a uniformed security guard who checked my ID against a list before directing me to a designated parking spot. As I walked toward the entrance, the heavy steel door hissed open, and Catherine Davies stood there, dressed in a severe business suit that seemed immune to the blistering heat. Beside her stood another guard, a large, silent man whose presence was a clear statement of control. Mr. Harding, you're on time, she said, her voice echoing in the cavernous, sterile lobby. Follow me. The inside of the facility was cold, the air humming with the sound of industrial-grade climate control. We went through another set of security checks before she led me to a heavy, circular vault door that looked like it belonged on a submarine. "Our deep archival facility is one of the most secure in the country," she stated, not with pride, but as a simple fact. "It preserves paper, film, and other sensitive media from deterioration. The asset you're interested in is located in the pre-acquisition wing, with other holdings from the Pacific Trust and Savings portfolio." The vault door swung open with a heavy sigh of displaced air. The room beyond was not what I expected. There were no romantic brass cages or marble floors. It was a vast, brightly lit warehouse, filled with rows upon rows of industrial shelving that stretched up into the darkness. On the shelves were tens of thousands of identical, gray, metal boxes, each labeled with a stenciled code. It was a library of secrets, filed with chilling efficiency. We walked in silence down a long aisle until Davies stopped, consulting a tablet. "Here we are. Section C, row 42, asset 1107. The catalog number corresponds to the key you hold." She nodded to the guard, who used a rolling ladder to retrieve a long, thin, metal box, coated in a fine layer of dust. They led me to a small, private viewing room. It was as sterile as a laboratory, containing only a steel table and 3 chairs. The guard placed the box on the table with a soft metallic thud. Davies sat opposite me. "Mr. Harding," she said, her voice formal. "Present the key." I reached into my pocket, my fingers closing around the cool, ornate brass. I slid it across the table. She picked it up with a gloved hand, examined it, and then inserted it into the lock on the box. The sound of the tumblers turning was impossibly loud in the silent room, a sharp, crisp click that echoed across 90 years. She slid the key back to me and nodded. "You may proceed." My heart was pounding. I took a breath and slowly, carefully, slid the inner container out of its sleeve. For a moment, I just stared. It was a time capsule. Elara Vance's last hope, perfectly preserved. On top lay several thick bundles of cash, held together by brittle paper bands from the Pacific Trust and Savings Bank. I could see the faces of forgotten presidents on the high-denomination bills. Beneath the money was a United States passport, issued in 1928. I opened it. The photograph was of Elara, but her hair was different, darker, and she wore no makeup. She looked startlingly ordinary. The name on the passport was Eleanor Martin, an echo of the name her secret lover's sister would one day give to her own daughter. Tucked beside the passport was a one-way ticket for the Golden State Limited train, scheduled to depart from Los Angeles to Chicago, dated November 8, 1928. It was, of course, unused. This was it. This was her entire escape plan, neatly packaged. The money, the new identity, the ticket to a new life. It was everything I expected to find. But there was something else. Underneath it all was a plain, manila envelope, sealed with wax. And unlike the other items, this one had a single word written on it in Elara's elegant script: insurance. My blood ran cold. This was the real reason for the box. This was the leverage. This was why Blackwood couldn't just let her disappear. He had to stop her from ever reaching this box. I looked at Catherine Davies. Her professional mask had slipped. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the envelope. "What is it?" she whispered. I carefully broke the brittle wax seal and opened the flap. Inside was not a letter or a document. It was a small, flat object wrapped in velvet cloth. I unwrapped it to reveal a 6-inch lacquer phonograph disc, the kind used for personal dictation recordings in the late 1920s. It was an experimental and fragile piece of technology for its time. A small label was affixed to its center. In the same handwriting, it read, SB, October 1928. SB Silas Blackwood. This was it. The smoking gun. A recording. Elara's voice, or perhaps Blackwood's, captured from the grave. This was her blackmail. Her proof of his abuse, his threats, whatever crimes he had committed that she was privy to. This was what she was holding over his head to ensure he wouldn't come after her. Before I could fully process the enormity of the discovery, Catherine Davies stood up abruptly, her composure restored, her lawyer's mind now fully engaged. "Mr. Harding," she said, her voice sharp and authoritative. "As of this moment, this process is concluded. The contents of this box are now the legal responsibility of Omnibank pending a full review. They constitute a previously unknown asset of a former client and, given the nature of this item," she gestured toward the record, "potential evidence in a criminal matter. We cannot release them to you." The security guard stepped forward. Davies began carefully placing every item, the money, the passport, the ticket, and most importantly, the record, into a secure transport case. What? I stammered, standing up. You can't do that. I'm the one who found it. This solves the case. You found it with our assistance and on our property, she countered, snapping the case shut. Our legal duty is to secure these assets and determine the correct course of action. This is now an internal matter. My victory, my incredible breakthrough, was being snatched away and locked in a different box, one made of corporate policy and legal firewalls. You will be contacted, she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. She handed me a business card. Do not contact us. They escorted me out of the vault, through the lobby, and back to the steel door I had entered what felt like a lifetime ago. The door hissed shut behind me, and I was standing alone in the blazing California sun, my hands completely empty. I had opened Pandora's box, only to have it snatched from my grasp by its new keepers. I drove away from that soulless building with a cold knot in my stomach. I didn't know the exact words spoken on that fragile black disc, but I knew one thing for sure. It was the sound of a murder. And I had a sinking feeling that Omnibank's legal team would do everything in their power to make sure it was never heard. The drive back to Los Angeles was a blur of impotent rage. I had held the solution to a 90-year-old murder in my hands for all of 10 minutes before it was confiscated by a corporate lawyer in the name of procedure. I had played their game, followed their rules, and my reward was to be shown the door, empty-handed and silenced by a non-disclosure agreement. Triumph had curdled into the bitterest kind of frustration. Back in my office, the cedar box Eleanor had given me sat on my desk, now feeling incomplete. The letters and the dried flower told the story of a tragic love, but the proof of the crime, the key to the entire case, was gone. It was locked away in a new vault, guarded by a dragon far more powerful than Silas Blackwood ever was. For the first time, I felt a profound sense of hopelessness. How could I, a lone writer, fight a global bank for a secret they now had every reason to bury? My first instinct was to go public. Write the story, name names, and let a storm of public outrage do what I couldn't. But the NDA Catherine Davies had made me sign was a legal bear trap. It was ironclad. Omnibank's lawyers would descend on me with the force of a tidal wave, drowning me in litigation until I was bankrupt and discredited. It was the nuclear option, and I wasn't ready to push that button yet. There had to be another way. There was only one person who might be able to help. I picked up the phone and dialed the only number I had for Arthur Pinter. I prayed he would answer. Pinter, he said, his voice cautious. Arthur, it's Jake Harding. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I told him everything. The passport, the train ticket, and the lacquer record labeled insurance. I described how Catherine Davies had immediately seized the items and shut down the entire operation. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When he finally spoke, I could hear a new note of concern in his voice. A phonograph record? Good heavens. I suspected you might find something significant, but this is beyond the pale. They're going to bury it, aren't they? I asked, the question flat and devoid of hope. Their first priority is, and always will be, the mitigation of risk for the corporation, Arthur confirmed, his voice low. A discovery of this magnitude is a crisis. They will not be thinking about historical justice. They will be thinking about scandal, liability, and the potential impact on their brand. Davies is smart and ambitious. She will have that record analyzed by the best audio forensics team they can find, and she will control the flow of information with absolute precision. So what can I do? I pressed. Is there any way to get it back? No, he said bluntly. Not directly. But you can anticipate their next move. The analysis will take time. Lacquer discs from that era are notoriously fragile. They'll need a specialist. While they are analyzing, their legal team will be doing their own research. They will be assessing their exposure. And part of that assessment, he paused, will involve the legacy of Silas Blackwood. And just like that, he had illuminated my next path. While the bank was focused on the evidence, I had to focus on the killer's shadow, a shadow that stretched all the way to the present day. Silas Blackwood had died a rich and powerful man. He had children, and those children had children. His estate would have become a formidable family trust or foundation, dedicated to preserving his wealth and his name. My work for the next 2 days was a deep dive into the Blackwood family tree. As I suspected, his immense fortune was now managed by the Blackwood Foundation, a powerful philanthropic organization with its name on university buildings and museum wings all over California. The foundation was run by his grandson, a man named Silas Blackwood III, a polished and ruthless corporate raider who was the very image of his ancestor. The Blackwoods were still royalty in Los Angeles, and I was about to accuse their patriarch of murder. I was researching the foundation's board of directors when the front door to my building buzzed. It was late afternoon. I wasn't expecting anyone. I buzzed them up, thinking it was a delivery. A few moments later, there was a soft knock on my office door. The man standing there was in his late 50s, dressed in a suit so perfectly tailored it seemed to have been spun from shadows and money. His silver hair was immaculate, his smile was cool and confident, and his eyes were the color of a winter sky. "Mr. Jake Harding?" he asked, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. "That's me," I said, staying behind my desk. "My name is Marcus Thorne," he said, extending a hand, which I reluctantly shook. "I'm the chief legal counsel for the Blackwood Foundation. May I have a moment of your time?" I felt a jolt, as if I'd touched a live wire. "How did you find me?" "Los Angeles is a surprisingly small town for those of us who make it our business to know things," he said, his smile never wavering. He took a seat without being invited. "I'm told you're a writer of some talent, a historian of a sort, and that your current project is a look back at the golden age of cinema." "Something like that," I said, my guard fully up. "Excellent," Thorne continued, getting comfortable. "The Foundation is, as you can imagine, very protective of Mr. Blackwood's legacy. We hear you've been digging, asking questions. We admire your diligence. In fact, we would be very interested in supporting your work. Perhaps an advance look at your manuscript, to ensure historical accuracy, of course. We might even be persuaded to help fund your research." The air in my small office suddenly felt thin and cold. This wasn't an offer, it was a threat, delivered with the casual grace of a predator. He was telling me that they knew. Omnibank must have made a discreet inquiry, and the Blackwood family had responded by sending their fixer. "My research is in its very early stages," I said, my voice tight. "There's nothing to see yet." "Of course," Thorne said, standing up. He placed a heavy linen business card on my desk. "Well, when you have something, you know where to find us. We look forward to a productive relationship, Mr. Harding. We would hate for any historical inaccuracies to tarnish a great man's name." He gave me one last, chillingly pleasant smile and left. The scent of his expensive cologne, something woody and complex, hung in the air long after he was gone. It was the smell of power, of secrets kept for generations. I looked at the card, then at the empty space on my desk where the evidence should have been. The Blackwood family wasn't a historical footnote anymore. They were here in the present, and they were watching me. The case wasn't just cold. It was getting hot, and I had the distinct feeling I was about to get burned. Marcus Thorne's visit was a declaration of war. His polite, veiled threats had done the opposite of what he intended. They hadn't scared me off the story, they had confirmed it. Innocent legacies don't require impeccably dressed lawyers to intimidate writers in dusty offices. Guilt does. The Blackwood Foundation's reaction was a flashing red light, illuminating the truth as brightly as any piece of evidence. They were hiding something. They knew. The immediate fear that had chilled the air in my office slowly receded, replaced by a hot, galvanizing anger. I was no longer just a writer uncovering a historical tragedy. I was a participant in its final act. I was being squeezed between two titans, a global bank that had my evidence and a powerful family that wanted it to stay buried forever. A direct assault on either was suicide. I needed a new strategy. I needed leverage. If I couldn't get my hands on the recording, I had to find another way to prove Blackwood's guilt. I needed to find a crack in the pristine marble facade of his legacy. And to do that, I needed to talk to someone who knew where the cracks were, someone who had been there when they were first formed. There was only one name that came to mind. Gloria Valenti. In the 1960s and 70s, Gloria Valenti's syndicated column, Gloria's Gaze, was the most feared and respected in Hollywood. She was the queen of the inside story, a confidant to some and a terror to others. She knew everything about everyone. She had been a reporter during the last years of the old studio system, a bridge between the golden age and the modern era. Now, she was 91 years old and living in retirement in Palm Springs. It was a long shot, but she was the last of her kind, a living library of Hollywood's darkest secrets. The drive to Palm Springs was a pilgrimage into a different version of the California dream. The urban jungle of LA gave way to the stark, dramatic beauty of the desert, where manicured golf courses and mid-century modern homes were defiant splashes of green and white against the brown, sun-scorched mountains. It was a town built on leisure and secrets, a fitting place for a queen in exile. Gloria lived in a low-slung white house with a turquoise door and a perfectly preserved vintage Thunderbird in the carport. The woman who answered the door was a younger, hired companion, but Gloria herself was waiting for me in a sun-drenched living room that looked like it had been hermetically sealed in 1968. She was reclined in a chaise lounge, wearing a silk kaftan and oversized sunglasses, a tumbler of what I guessed was gin on the table beside her. She was frail, but the sharp intelligence behind the dark glasses was almost a physical force. "So you're the writer who thinks he's found a new angle on an old story," she said, her voice a throaty rasp. She didn't ask me to sit. "I get a call from one of you kids every 6 months. Hollywood's dead, darling. You're just picking at bones." "I think the bones are starting to talk," I said, deciding to get straight to the point. "I'm not just writing about Elara Vance. I'm investigating her murder." She waved a dismissive, bony hand. "Everyone knows she was murdered. Proving it is another story. The town was built on making inconvenient stories disappear. Silas Blackwood was the one who made it disappear," I countered. "And I have proof." That got her attention. She slowly sat up, her eyes, hidden behind the glasses, fixed on me. I laid it all out for her. Julian Croft. The escape plan. The safe deposit box. The lacquer record labeled insurance. The confiscation by Omnibank. And finally, the visit from the Blackwood Foundation's lawyer, Marcus Thorne. When I mentioned Thorne's name, I saw the faintest flicker of a reaction, a tightening of the muscles around her jaw. She knew exactly who and what he was. When I finished, she was silent for a long time, swirling the ice in her glass. "Marcus Thorne," she finally said, the name tasting like poison in her mouth. "The Blackwoods have always kept a dog like that on a leash. A well-dressed man to do their dirty work. If they sent him to you, then you're not just picking at bones, kid. You're rattling the family crypt." She finally gestured for me to sit. "You're in trouble," she said, with a certain grim satisfaction. "The Blackwood family is a machine designed for one purpose, self-preservation. And that bank, they're even worse. They'll sit on that recording until it turns to dust if it saves them from a lawsuit. You're caught in the gears. Which is why I need your help, Miss Valenti," I pleaded. "You knew these people. You knew their world. What don't I know about Silas Blackwood?" A wry, cynical smile played on her lips. "What don't you know? You only know the appetizer, darling. Silas was a predator in a town full of them. He didn't just run a studio, he ran a kingdom. Let me tell you a story." She told me about a young starlet in the mid-1940s, a girl who made the mistake of falling for Blackwood, and then the bigger mistake of trying to leave him for a handsome young actor. Her career was over in a week, Gloria said, her voice low. Whispering campaigns, contracts pulled, theaters refusing to show her pictures. She was erased. And the young actor? He went on a hunting trip a month later. Tripped and fell. His rifle went off. Shattered his leg. He never walked without a limp again. And he never worked in this town again. Nothing was ever proven, but the message was clear. What Silas Blackwood owns, he keeps. It was the pattern. The same possessive rage, the same brutal retribution. Elara Vance wasn't an isolated incident. She was just the one who got away, in the most permanent way possible. The Blackwood Foundation isn't about charity, Gloria scoffed. It's about reputation laundering. They spend $1 billion to make sure no one ever remembers what their family was built on. "So how do I fight them?" I asked. Gloria looked out the window at the shimmering desert heat. "You can't fight their money, but you can fight their secrets." Silas had a man. Not a lawyer like Thorne. A real fixer. An ex-cop named Manny Grossman. He was a troll, but he was Blackwood's troll. He did the dirty work. The intimidation, the payoffs, the cleanup. My pulse quickened. This was it. A new path. "Manny died in the early 80s, she continued. "But I heard he was a meticulous note-taker. He came from the old school. He didn't trust memories. He trusted ledgers. He kept a record of every job he ever did for Blackwood, a little insurance policy of his own. Where are those ledgers now?" I asked, leaning forward. "Who knows?" she shrugged. "Probably buried in a landfill. But Manny had a daughter. Last I heard, years ago, she was still alive. A quiet woman, nothing like her father. Lived somewhere in the valley. Probably an old woman herself now. If those records still exist anywhere, she'd be the one to have them. Tucked away in a dusty box in the garage, I'd imagine. A fixer's files." The thought sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through me. It was a desperate long shot, a ghost from my generation hunting for the records of a ghost from his. But in a case this cold, against opponents this powerful, it was the only kind of shot I had. I thanked Gloria profusely. She just waved her hand. "Don't thank me, kid," she said, her dark glasses glinting. "Just burn them to the ground." As I drove away from that perfect time capsule of a house, I had a new name in my notebook. Not a victim, not a killer, but a facilitator. A dead man's daughter. My next target wasn't a bank or a foundation. It was a ghost secret history. Driving back from Palm Springs, the desert landscape blurred into a single, hopeful mirage. Gloria Valenti had given me more than just a story. She had given me a name, a ghost to chase through the archives of the city. Manny Grossman. The Fixer. A man paid to sweep monsters under the rug. If the recording in Omnibank's vault was the story of the crime, then Manny Grossman's records were the receipt. My hunt for the daughter of a long-dead private investigator began the moment I got back to my office. The name Manny Grossman yielded little in the mainstream press, just a few mentions in old articles about his time as a beat cop with the LAPD before he retired early to pursue private enterprise in the late 1920s. He was a shadow, deliberately staying out of the spotlight his clients so desperately craved. The key, as it so often is, was in public records. I pulled up his death certificate from 1982. The cause of death was listed as cirrhosis of the liver, a fitting end for a man who likely spent his life pickling his conscience in cheap whiskey. And there, listed under next of kin, was the name I was looking for, daughter, Rachel Grossman. The trail was still faint. A woman with a name like Grossman in a city like Los Angeles was likely to have married and changed it decades ago. I started the painstaking process of cross-referencing marriage licenses from the 1960s and 70s. 4 hours, I sifted through the digital records of other people's happy beginnings, searching for the daughter of a man who specialized in brutal endings. Finally, I found it, a 1965 marriage certificate for Rachel Grossman and David Weiss. A new search for Rachel Weiss was much more fruitful. I found a woman in her late 70s, widowed, living at the same address in Van Nuys for the past 45 years. It was a small, unassuming house in a quiet, suburban corner of the San Fernando Valley, a world away from the glitz of Bel Air and the grit of Hollywood. It was the perfect place to live a normal life, to escape the long shadow of a father like Manny Grossman. As I drove to her house the next afternoon, I felt a familiar mix of anxiety and anticipation. This was a delicate operation. I wasn't approaching Eleanor Peterson, the keeper of a tragic love story. I was approaching the daughter of the man who likely buried the body. What would she be like? Protective, ashamed, ignorant. The house was a modest, single-story home with a neatly manicured lawn and a lovingly tended rose garden. It was the picture of suburban tranquility. I rang the bell, and after a moment, the door opened a few inches. The woman who peered out was small and silver-haired, with tired, cautious eyes that had seen more than their share of trouble. "Yes," she asked, her voice soft but wary. "Mrs. Weiss. Rachel Weiss." I asked, "Who are you?" "My name is Jake Harding. I'm a writer. I was hoping I could speak to you for a few minutes about your father, Manny Grossman." The warmth drained from her face, leaving behind a guarded, pained expression. "My father? I'm sorry, I don't talk about my father's work. That was a very long time ago." She began to close the door. "Please," I said, putting a hand up, not to stop the door, but as a gesture of appeal. "I'm not here to cast judgment. I'm trying to find the truth about what happened to a young woman named Elara Vance." Her hand froze on the door. Her eyes, which had been distant, suddenly focused on me with a sharp, painful recognition. The name, even after all these years, was a key. It was the name of the original sin, the one that had paid for this house, for her quiet life. She hesitated for a long moment, then slowly, reluctantly, opened the door. "You should come in," she said quietly. The inside of her home was cozy and filled with the mementos of a long, happy marriage and a proud family. Photos of her late husband, her children, her grandchildren. It was a shrine to normalcy, and I realized it was a life built in deliberate opposition to the one her father had led. "I loved my father," she said, her voice barely a whisper as she led me to her small living room. "But I was also afraid of him. He was two different men. The man who taught me how to ride a bike, and the man who came home late at night smelling of cigars and something else, something cold. He called his work for Mr. Blackwood, tidying up. I didn't understand what that meant until I was much older, and then I tried very hard to forget." "Did he ever talk about his work?" I asked gently. "Never," she shook her head. "But he wrote things down. Everything. He didn't trust anyone, not even Mr. Blackwood. He said his ledgers were his retirement plan. After he died, my mother wanted to burn everything, but I couldn't. It felt wrong. Like erasing a piece of him, even the bad parts. My heart was beating a steady, heavy rhythm against my ribs. "Mrs. Weiss, do you still have those ledgers?" She looked at me, her eyes filled with a lifetime of conflicted emotions. For a moment, I thought she would say no, that she would ask me to leave. But then, a look of resolve settled on her face. It was the look of someone finally deciding to let go of a heavy burden. For 60 years, I've lived with the ghosts of what my father did, she said. Maybe it's time to let them go. She led me not to an office, but out the back door to a detached garage. It was filled with the dusty detritus of a lifetime. In the corner, beneath a stack of old blankets, was a black, metal footlocker, secured with a heavy, rusted padlock. She produced a small key from a hook on the wall and opened it. The smell of old paper and mildew filled the air. Inside, stacked neatly, were a dozen leather-bound accounting ledgers. I looked through them once a long time ago, she said, her back to me. I never looked again. She turned to me, her eyes pleading. Take them, please. Do something good with them. Find some peace for that poor girl. I never could. I could only nod, my throat tight. I carefully lifted the ledgers from the trunk and carried them to my car. As I drove away, leaving Rachel Weisz standing in the doorway of her quiet, normal life, I felt the immense weight of what I was carrying. These books weren't just history, they were a reckoning. I pulled over a few blocks away, unable to wait. I opened the ledger marked 1928 to 1930. The entries were written in a precise, spidery hand. They were coded, mostly initials and cryptic phrases, but the meaning was clear. Dates, expenses, payments. It was the bookkeeping of a monster. I flipped through the brittle yellowed pages, my fingers shaking slightly, until I found the date I was looking for. November 7th, 1928. The entry was short, simple, and more horrifying than any confession. It read, November 7th, 28, SB request. The Vance problem, final resolution. Location, Griffith. Expenses, lime, 2 bags, shovels, 2, transport, local. Payment wrecked in full. It wasn't a story. It wasn't a confession. It was an invoice. The cold, methodical accounting of a soul's disposal. And I had it in my hands. The case against Silas Blackwood was no longer just a theory. I had the fixer's own ledger. I had the proof. I sat in my car for a long time, the quiet suburban street outside fading into an irrelevant blur. The only thing that was real was the open ledger on my passenger seat. The book smelled of dust and decay, but the words written on its pages were alive with a terrible, vibrant darkness. Expenses, lime, 2 bags, shovels, 2, transport, local. It was the banality of the evil that struck me the deepest. A life, a light as bright as Elara Vance's, extinguished and then itemized like a hardware store receipt. Manny Grossman hadn't just been a fixer. He had been the bookkeeper of Silas Blackwood's soul, and his ledgers were the final, damning accounting. The location, Griffith, was a punch to the gut. Griffith Park, a sprawling, wild oasis in the heart of the city, visited by millions. Had she been lying there all this time, buried in a shallow, unmarked grave, while the city she had once captivated grew up around her? The wave of revulsion passed, replaced by a cold, clear sense of purpose. The waiting was over. The pleading was over. Gloria Valenti was right. I was caught in the gears of 2 machines. But now, I had a wrench. A big one. And I was about to throw it right into the heart of both of them. Back in my office, I set my plan in motion. I spent 2 hours with a high-resolution scanner, digitizing every page of Manny Grossman's ledgers. I then took the originals, sealed them in an airtight container, and drove to a bank. There, I placed them in a safe deposit box of my own. The irony was not lost on me. The proof of Elara's murder was now secured in the same kind of vault that had held the proof of her hope. With the originals secured and the copies on my hard drive, I was ready. I picked up the phone and dialed the number on the heavy linen business card Marcus Thorne had left on my desk. He answered on the second ring. Thorne. His voice was as smooth and controlled as ever. Mr. Thorne, I said, my own voice calm, level. Jake Harding. I'm calling to follow up on our recent conversation. My research has progressed significantly. I've come into possession of some business records belonging to an associate of the late Mr. Blackwood, a man named Manny Grossman. There was a split second of silence on the line, a vacuum so profound it was like a confession in itself. Thorne's polished armor had been pierced. I can't imagine what that has to do with, he began, but I cut him off. The records are quite detailed, I continued, ignoring his attempt to regain control. They're written in a ledger. I thought the Foundation might be particularly interested in an entry from November 7th, 1928. It's a fascinating piece of accounting. It even mentions the purchase of shovels. The silence this time was longer. I could picture him in his high-rise office, the carefully constructed world of the Blackwood legacy crumbling around him. He was a fixer, just like Manny Grossman, but the game had changed. "What do you want, Mr. Harding?" he asked, the silkiness gone from his voice, replaced by a raw, guttural edge. "I want a meeting," I said. "Not with you. With your boss, Silas Blackwood III. I will show him what I have. He needs to see with his own 2 eyes the sins of his grandfather." "That's not possible," he snapped. "It is now," I replied. "You tell him. He'll see me." I hung up before he could respond. My hand was steady. My heart was a block of ice. I took a deep breath, and then I dialed the number on Catherine Davies's business card. "Davies," she answered, her voice as crisp and professional as I remembered. "Ms. Davies, Jake Harding calling. I trust the analysis of the recording from Asset 1107 is proceeding. I am not at liberty to discuss an ongoing internal review, Mr. Harding. You know that." "Of course," I said, my tone oozing with false courtesy. "This is just a professional courtesy call. I thought you and your colleagues at Omnibank should be aware that my investigation is no longer solely reliant on that recording. I have acquired new, independent evidence that confirms the circumstances of Elara Vance's death. Specifically, the signed, dated ledger of the man who committed the murder, on the direct orders of Silas Blackwood." I let that sink in. I could hear the faint, frantic clicking of a keyboard on her end. "Furthermore," I added, delivering the final blow, "I am currently arranging a meeting with the Blackwood Foundation to present them with this evidence. I'm sure during our conversation, the existence of a certain phonograph recording will come up. It would be a shame for Omnibank to be put in the position of actively concealing key evidence in a murder investigation that is about to become very, very public. Obstruction of justice is such an ugly phrase, don't you think? It tends to affect stock prices." This time, her silence was utter, complete shock. I had turned her own corporate logic against her. I had made keeping the secret more of a liability than revealing it. "I'll be in touch, Miss Davies," I said and hung up. I leaned back in my chair, the 2 phone calls echoing in my mind. I had set 2 fires, and now I could only wait and see which way the wind blew. I felt a surge of adrenaline, but also a deep, profound sense of dread. I had made myself the singular focus of a very powerful, very guilty family's rage. I didn't have to wait long. An hour later, my phone rang. It was Marcus Thorne. His voice was clipped, tight with fury and resignation. "Mr. Blackwood will see you," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. My office." He gave me the address of a sleek, black skyscraper in the heart of Century City. "I'll be there," I said. The invitation was an admission of guilt. They weren't meeting with me to review my research. They were meeting to assess the threat. They were meeting to find out my price. But I wasn't after money. I was after justice. A confession 90 years in the making. And as I prepared my files for the meeting, printing out the damning ledger page, I knew I was walking into the lion's den. But for the first time, I was the one with the teeth. The morning of the meeting, I dressed with the care of a man preparing for battle. Not in armor, but in a simple, dark suit. It was a uniform, a signal that I was meeting them on their turf, by their rules, but I was not intimidated. I drove west, toward the gleaming steel and glass towers of Century City, the modern heart of Los Angeles' power elite. This was a world away from the old Hollywood of crumbling studios and ghosts. This was the clean, sterile, and infinitely more ruthless world of corporate power that Silas Blackwood's sins had built. The offices of the Blackwood Foundation occupied the entire top floor of the tallest skyscraper. The view was breathtaking, a panoramic vista of the city stretching from the ocean to the mountains. The entire space was a monument to wealth and influence, decorated with priceless modern art and furniture that cost more than my entire office building. It was all designed to make a visitor feel insignificant. Marcus Thorne met me at the elevator. The false charm was gone, replaced by a cold, barely concealed hostility. "Mr. Blackwood is waiting for you," he said, and led me down a long, silent hallway to a set of imposing oak doors. The office beyond was vast. At the far end, silhouetted against a floor-to-ceiling window, a man stood looking out over the city. He turned as I entered. This was Silas Blackwood III. He was in his 60s, with a full head of silver hair, a handsome, tanned face, and the predatory stillness of a shark. He wore a suit that was the color of money and exuded an aura of absolute, unshakable entitlement. He was the living embodiment of his grandfather's legacy. "Mr. Harding," he said, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone. He did not offer to shake my hand. "My counsel tells me you've been working on a piece of historical fiction. and that you believe you've found something of interest to my family." He gestured to a single, solitary chair placed an uncomfortable distance from his massive desk. Thorn stood silently by the door. The power dynamics were clear. I walked to the desk, ignoring the chair. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper, a high-resolution, color copy of the ledger entry for November 7, 1928. I placed it in the center of the vast, polished expanse of wood and slid it toward him. "I don't deal in fiction, Mr. Blackwood," I said, my voice quiet but carrying in the silent room. "I deal in accounting." He picked up the paper. Thorn moved to his side. I watched their faces as they read the damning, banal words. Thorn's professional composure vanished, replaced by a flicker of raw panic. But Blackwood's reaction was different. There was no shock, no outrage. I saw only a flicker of something cold and dark in his eyes, not surprise, but a weary, grim recognition. He was a man confirming a story he had likely heard in whispers his entire life. The family secret was no longer a secret. He placed the paper down carefully. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw the true predator beneath the civilized veneer. "This is a very interesting document," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "A historical curiosity. What is it you want, Mr. Harding?" Thorn began to speak, likely to deny everything, but Blackwood raised a hand, silencing him. He knew denial was useless. He had moved on to damage control. This was a business negotiation. "Let's be clear about what I want," I said, meeting his gaze. "I'm not here for a payoff. My silence is not for sale." A flicker of genuine surprise crossed Blackwood's face. Money was the only language he truly spoke, the solution to every problem. "First," I said, laying out my terms, "the Blackwood Foundation will issue a public statement acknowledging that new evidence has come to light regarding its founder, Silas Blackwood, and his direct involvement in the 1928 disappearance and death of Elara Vance." Thorn scoffed. "That is insane. Absolutely not." I ignored him, my eyes locked on Blackwood. "Second, your foundation will use its considerable influence to contact the legal department at Omnibank. You will jointly request, no, demand, the immediate release of the phonograph recording found in Miss Vance's safe deposit box. You will make it clear that concealing it now, in light of this new evidence, would be a public relations and legal catastrophe for them. And third," I continued, "the foundation will establish a charitable grant in Elara Vance's name. A significant one. It will be dedicated to the preservation of silent films and the support of young actresses who are not protected by the studio system. You will restore the legacy your grandfather destroyed." Blackwood stared at me, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his lips. It didn't reach his eyes. "You have a great deal of nerve, Mr. Harding. You walk in here, into my building, and you make demands. You are in no position to do so." "I'm in the only position that matters," I countered, playing my final card. "The ledger entry contains a location. A single word, Griffith. As in Griffith Park. I know where Manny Grossman buried her. Now, you have a choice. You can control this narrative, put out a carefully worded statement, and manage the story. Or, I can walk out of here and make an anonymous call to the LAPD with a map. And you can spend the next 6 months watching news helicopters broadcast live footage of police digging up your family's dirty secret from the middle of a public park. Which scenario do you think is better for the Blackwood name?" Checkmate. The room was silent for a full minute. I could see the cold calculation in Blackwood's eyes as he weighed the options. He was a ruthless pragmatist, and he knew when he was beaten. The public spectacle of a body being discovered was an unmanageable crisis. My demands, while distasteful to him, were a form of controlled demolition. He finally looked at Thorn, his voice like ice. "Handle it," he said. "Give him what he wants." He turned his back on me and stared out the window, his posture radiating defeat and cold fury. My audience was over. I walked out of that office, past a shell-shocked Marcus Thorn, and didn't look back. The victory didn't feel triumphant. It felt heavy, somber. As I stepped out of the sterile, air-conditioned tower into the bright California sun, my phone buzzed. It was Catherine Davies from Omnibank. Her voice was completely different, no longer sharp and dismissive, but cautious and deferential. "Mr. Harding," she said, "we've just received a communication from counsel for the Blackwood Foundation regarding Asset 1107. We are prepared to cooperate fully in this matter. We are having the recording professionally digitized. A copy will be messengered to you within 48 hours. I hung up the phone and looked back at the glass tower. The war was over. The giants had surrendered. I had won. Now, all that was left was to listen to the ghost. The 48 hours after my meeting with Silas Blackwood III were some of the strangest of my life. The war was, for all intents and purposes, over. I had won, but it was a victory that felt hollow, incomplete. I had the facts, the ledgers, the admission of guilt from a powerful family. I had solved the who and the how. But the why, the true human heart of the story, was still missing. It was locked away in the grooves of a fragile lacquer disc, a voice silenced for nearly a century. I spent those 2 days in my office, doing nothing productive. I couldn't write, I couldn't research. I simply waited. I'd find myself staring at the glossy studio portraits of Elara, at her luminous, melancholy eyes, and wonder what she had sounded like. In an era of silent stars, her voice was a complete mystery. Was it high and girlish? Was it low and sultry? Was it the voice of a victim or the voice of a fighter? I felt like an archaeologist waiting for a tomb to be opened, knowing that the final, crucial artifact was about to be revealed. On the second afternoon, a professional courier arrived. He carried a sleek, silver briefcase, which he unlocked to reveal a single padded, tamper-proof envelope. I signed a formidable-looking chain of custody document, and he was gone. I was left alone in my office with the package. It felt impossibly heavy. Inside was a letter from Catherine Davies, its tone strictly professional, confirming that the contents were a complete and unedited digital transfer of the audio from Asset 1107. And beside it, a single, black USB drive. The voice of a ghost, captured on a tiny piece of modern technology. I didn't listen to it right away. The moment felt too significant to rush. I waited until night had fallen over the city, until the sounds of traffic had faded to a distant hum. I closed the blinds, shutting out the glittering lights of the present. I poured myself 2 fingers of whiskey, the familiar ritual of a writer steeling himself for a difficult task. I sat at my desk, the only light coming from the green glow of my desk lamp. It was just me, the silence, and the story's final secret. I plugged the drive into my computer. A single audio file appeared on the screen, EV_1028.wave. I put on my headphones, took a slow sip of whiskey, and clicked play. The first sound was a loud crackle, followed by a thick, steady hiss, like the sound of a seashell held to the ear. It was the sound of time itself, the static of 90 lost years. And then, through the hiss, a voice emerged. It was not what I had expected. It wasn't the grand, theatrical voice of a movie star. It was quiet, clear, and low, with a slight, almost imperceptible tremor. It was the voice of a woman who was terrified, but who had found a core of unbreakable steel within herself. It was the voice of Elara Vance. "My name is Elara Vance," she began, her words measured and deliberate. "If you are hearing this, it is because my plan to be free has failed. It is because Silas Blackwood has found me. And it is because I am likely dead." My hands tightened on the desk. The ghost was speaking. "For 3 years, I have been the property of Mr. Blackwood. He calls me his star, his creation. But I am his prisoner. The public sees the premieres and the pearls, but they do not see the bruises he covers with makeup, or the locked doors. They do not hear the things he says to me in his study, the one he had soundproofed so no one could hear me scream. The detail from Fincher's notes, confirmed by her own voice. It was chilling. He is a man possessed by a sickness of ownership," she continued, her voice gaining strength, a cold fury burning beneath the surface. "He believes he owns my face, my time, my life. When he learned that my heart belonged to another, to a good and gentle man named Julian Croft, his sickness turned into a rage. He told me, he promised me, that he would rather see me in a grave than in the arms of another man. He said he would destroy Julian, and that he would erase me from the earth." The recording was her deposition, her final statement, recorded in secret. She was bearing witness to her own murder. "And so, we made a plan. A desperate plan to escape. To run away and live a simple life, a real life. The money is saved. The new identities are ready. Tonight, I will perform one last time, on the screen and in my life. I will vanish. But I leave this record behind as my insurance. It is my truth. If I do not make it to Julian, know that Silas Blackwood is the reason. He is a monster hiding in plain sight, and my only regret is that I did not have the strength to escape him sooner." The recording fell silent for a moment, and I could hear her take a shaky breath. When she spoke again, the fury was gone, replaced by an aching, heartbreaking tenderness. "And Julian, if you should ever hear this, know that I was on my way. Know that my last thought was of you. Know that the short time I had with you was the only part of my life that was ever truly real. I love you." The last words were a whisper. Then there was a soft click, and the sound of the recording ended, leaving only the empty, hissing sound of the past. I took off my headphones and sat in the profound, crushing silence of my office. The whiskey was untouched. Tears were streaming down my face. She was no longer a beautiful, tragic face in a photograph. She was no longer a cold case. I had heard her voice. I had heard her truth. She was real. The case was solved. The killer was exposed, his legacy now forever stained. The powerful had been forced to bend. But my job wasn't over. I had one last duty to perform. The ghost had spoken, and her final words were not a plea for justice, but a message of love. It was my job to deliver it. I picked up the phone, my thumb hovering over the number for a quiet house in Ohio. The case was closed. But the story, Elara's real story, was just about to find its ending. The case was closed, but the story was not yet finished. A 90-year-old crime does not simply end with a forced confession in a corporate high-rise. It ends when its ghosts are finally laid to rest. Elara's recording was more than a piece of evidence. It was a last will and testament, and her final words were not for the police or the public, but for the man she had died trying to reach. Julian Croft was long gone, but his memory lived on in a quiet house in Ohio, cared for by the last member of his family. I had one more message to deliver. I called Eleanor Peterson that evening. I didn't tell her the full, brutal details over the phone. I simply told her that I had found something extraordinary, something I could not send through the mail. I told her I had found Elara's voice, and I asked if I could bring it to her. Her silence on the other end of the line was filled with a fragile, hopeful trepidation. "Yes," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Please, bring her home." The second flight to Ohio was the polar opposite of the first. My initial trip had been a tense, uncertain hunt for a lead. This journey was a pilgrimage. I wasn't an investigator anymore. I was a custodian. The USB drive in my pocket felt less like a piece of data and more like a sacred relic. I was carrying the last words of a long-lost love across the country, to finally complete a journey that had been violently interrupted 9 decades earlier. Eleanor was waiting for me on her porch when I arrived. She was dressed in a simple but elegant lavender dress, her silver hair perfectly coiffed. She looked as though she were preparing to meet royalty. There was a profound, quiet dignity about her. We didn't speak much at first. She led me into the same immaculate living room, where a fresh pot of tea was already waiting. The air was thick with unspoken history. "I'm ready," she said, her hands folded calmly in her lap, though I could see the slight tremor in her fingers. I took out my laptop, the sleek, modern device looking strangely out of place amongst her dark, polished wood furniture. I placed it on the coffee table between us, opened the audio file, and attached a small, high-quality speaker so she could hear it clearly. "The audio quality is not very good," I said softly. "There's a lot of static. But she's in there." Eleanor nodded, her pale blue eyes fixed on the screen as if she could see through it, back in time. "My Uncle Julian waited his whole life to hear her again," she whispered. "I suppose I can wait through a little static." I took a breath and pressed play. The hiss and crackle filled the quiet room. Eleanor leaned forward slightly. And then, Elara's voice, clear and low, emerged from the past. "My name is Elara Vance." I didn't watch the screen. I watched Eleanor. As Elara's recorded testimony unfolded, I saw a lifetime of family tragedy being reprocessed on her face. I saw the grim understanding as Elara described Blackwood's cruelty, a confirmation of the monstrous shadow that had driven her beloved uncle into a 50-year exile. I saw the deep, empathetic sorrow for a young woman so trapped, so desperate. But when Elara's voice shifted, when she began to speak of Julian, Eleanor's carefully maintained composure finally broke. A single tear traced a path down her wrinkled cheek. Her expression softened into one of profound, heartbreaking beauty. She was not just hearing a confession, she was hearing the other half of a love story that had been the central, unspoken myth of her own family. The recording reached its final, whispered words. "The short time I had with you was the only part of my life that was ever truly real. I love you." A soft click, and then the hissing of the empty recording was the only sound in the room. Eleanor didn't move for a long time. She sat with her eyes closed, tears flowing freely now, but she was smiling. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated peace. "He never knew," she finally said, her voice thick with emotion. "My mother told me he always wondered. He blamed himself. He thought perhaps he had pressured her, that she had gotten cold feet and simply changed her mind. He died wondering if her love had been real." She opened her eyes and looked at me, and they were shining. It was real. She was on her way to him. All these years, he just needed to know she was on her way. She had found the piece that had eluded her uncle his entire life. The wound at the center of her family's history had finally been closed. Before I left, I transferred the audio file to a small, simple digital audio player I had bought, with large, easy-to-use buttons. "This belongs to you," I said, placing it in her hand. "It belongs to your family." She nodded, clutching it like a precious jewel. "Thank you, Mr. Harding. You've given my uncle the one thing he never had. You've given him his ending." As I stood to leave, she stopped me. "Wait," she said, and disappeared into a back room. She returned with a worn, leather-bound book of sheet music. This was his. He never showed it to anyone. I think he wrote it for her. I opened it. The title on the first page, written in Julian's elegant hand, was simply Elara's Theme. It was the last piece of their story. Flying back to Los Angeles that evening, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't expected. The case was no longer just a collection of facts, clues, and confrontations. It was a story that now had a soul. I had delivered the ghost's message. But the story wasn't quite over. A press release from the Blackwood Foundation was being drafted by a team of expensive lawyers. A memorial fund was being created. And somewhere, in the wild chaparral-covered hills of Griffith Park, a silent movie star was still waiting to be brought home. The day the truth came out was a strangely quiet one, at first. I sat in my office, watching the morning news, knowing that a single, carefully worded press release was about to detonate a 90-year-old bomb under the polished veneer of Hollywood history. I had lit the fuse, and now my role was simply to bear witness. I felt a profound sense of detachment, as if the story was no longer mine. It belonged to the world now. At precisely 9 a.m. Pacific time, it happened. The Blackwood Foundation's press release went live. It was a masterwork of legal maneuvering and public relations jiu-jitsu. It never used the word murder. It spoke of newly discovered, tragic historical circumstances and the probable, unauthorized actions of our founder, Silas Blackwood. It expressed deep and profound regret for the unimaginable suffering of Elara Vance. It was a confession wrapped in the velvet glove of corporate apology. It simultaneously admitted to the crime while carefully partitioning the guilt, sealing it away with a man who was long dead, protecting the modern foundation from the sins of its creator. And, as I had demanded, it announced the immediate establishment of the Elara Vance Memorial Grant for film preservation. They had given me everything I wanted. For a few minutes, there was silence. And then the storm broke. My phone began to vibrate against the wood of my desk, a frantic, buzzing tremor that would not stop for the next 72 hours. On my computer screen, news alerts began to cascade, one after another, each headline more sensational than the last. Hollywood's oldest mystery solved. Foundation implicates founder in Starlet's death. The Silent Starlet. Secret ledgers reveal 1928 murder plot. Silas Blackwood. Pioneer. Titan. Killer. The story was a supernova. It had everything. Glamour, money, a tragic love, a secret murder, and a powerful dynasty brought to its knees. By noon, news vans with satellite dishes sprouting from their roofs were camped out on the street below my office. My email inbox was hemorrhaging with requests from every major news network, documentary producer, and publishing house in the country. I was no longer Jake Harding, writer. I was the man who had unearthed Hollywood's original sin. I didn't answer a single call. I didn't reply to a single email. This part of the story wasn't about me. It was about her. The press release had noted that all new evidence, including specifics as to the probable resting place of Miss Vance, had been turned over to the Los Angeles Police Department. I knew what that meant. I grabbed my keys and drove towards the hills. Griffith Park was a circus. The quiet, winding road that led up towards the observatory was choked with traffic. Police tape, stark and yellow, cordoned off a wide, secluded ravine, a place I had identified from old maps that matched Manny Grossman's likely route. Inside the perimeter, a mobile command post had been set up. Forensic teams in white jumpsuits moved with quiet, methodical purpose. And everywhere else, the media swarmed like locusts, cameras and microphones pointed at the cordoned-off patch of earth, all of them waiting. I found a vantage point on a higher trail, away from the chaos, where I could look down on the scene. It was a surreal spectacle. The quiet, lonely place where a young woman's dreams had been brutally buried was now the set of a global media event. The final, terrible, private moment of her life was being exhumed for public consumption. I felt a surge of profound sadness and a deep, tragic sense of irony. Elara had spent her life trying to escape the relentless gaze of the public, and now in death, she was the biggest story in the world. 4 hours, I watched them work. The sun beat down. The helicopters chopped the air overhead. And then, in the late afternoon, I saw it. A subtle shift in the energy of the forensic team. One of the diggers stopped, raising a hand. A supervisor hurried over. The work became slower, more delicate, tools replaced by brushes. They had found her. Even from my distance, I could feel the change. A hush fell over the officials within the tape. A message was relayed. A black coroner's van began a slow, respectful journey up the hill. They had found Elara Vance. I didn't need to see any more. I turned and walked away before the news could break, before her name could be shouted across the airwaves once more. I slipped through the crowds, an anonymous face, just another curious onlooker. Back in my office that night, the world outside was still screaming her name. The calls hadn't stopped. The offers were likely getting bigger. But I ignored them all. The investigation was over. The public fallout would rage for weeks, a firestorm of speculation and scandal. Books would be written, movies would be made. Her story would be consumed, commodified, and turned into content. But I had something they didn't. I had the letters from a man who loved her. I had the memory of her voice on a fragile recording. I had the sheet music for a theme written just for her. The world would get the headlines, the scandal, the story of a murder. They could have the cold case. I sat down at my desk, the glow of the lamp pushing back the shadows. I was going to write the love story. In the weeks that followed the discovery in Griffith Park, the story of Elara Vance raged like a wildfire through the global consciousness. It was a perfect, terrible storm of celebrity, murder, and high society scandal. I watched from the sidelines as the world consumed the narrative I had unearthed. I saw Silas Blackwood III step down from his foundation, disappearing from public life entirely. I saw Marcus Thorne's name vanish from the foundation's letterhead. The Blackwood Empire, while financially intact, was morally bankrupt, its name forever synonymous with a brutal, 90-year-old crime. The LAPD officially closed the case, naming Silas Blackwood as the sole person of interest in the death of Elara Vance, and Manny Grossman as an accessory. It was a symbolic gesture, a final line drawn in a book that had been left open for far too long. Elara was given a funeral. It was a strange, surreal affair. The service was held at the Hollywood Forever Cemetery, a place where the ghosts of the movie industry reside in manicured perpetuity. It was attended by a bizarre mix of people, somber film historians, heads of preservation societies who saw her as a martyr to the studio system, and current Hollywood executives, their faces a mask of calculated solemnity, there to be seen paying their respects. I stood at the very back, an anonymous face in the crowd, and watched as they finally laid her to rest. After nearly a century of being a lost soul, a whispered myth, Elara Vance had a place to sleep. Throughout the media frenzy, I remained silent. I turned down every interview, every seven-figure book deal from publishers who wanted a sensational, tell-all exposé. The story the world wanted was one of a monster and his victim. But that wasn't the story I needed to tell. The real story wasn't about how Elara died. It was about how she had lived and how she had loved. I found my own form of closure in quiet conversations. I called Eleanor Peterson in Ohio after the funeral. She had watched it on the news. They buried her next to a famous director, she said, her voice soft and clear. But I like to think she's with Julian now, that they finally found their quiet place. She told me she listened to Elara's recording every few days, not for the story of her death, but for the sound of her love. She thanked me one last time for giving her family's ghost a voice. I also spoke with Rachel Weisz. She too had followed the news. She felt a quiet, profound relief. The secrets her father had been paid to bury had finally come to light, and in doing so, a small part of the burden she had carried her whole life had been lifted. "You did a good thing, Mr. Harding," she told me. "My father, he was what he was. But you used his darkness to bring some light. I think, in a strange way, he might have respected that." My final call was to Gloria Valenti. She was, as expected, deliciously cynical about the whole affair. "Look at them all," she rasped over the phone from Palm Springs. The studio heads and the agents, weeping their crocodile tears for a girl their own kind destroyed. "They haven't changed a bit, darling. They just got better lawyers." But beneath the acid, I could hear a note of deep, professional satisfaction. "Still," she added, "you did it, kid. You took a pickaxe to the cornerstone of that filthy dynasty. They'll never be able to wash the stain away. Not bad for a bone picker." With those final conversations, the threads of my investigation felt complete. The people who had helped me, the quiet keepers of the past, had all found their own measure of peace. My office was quiet now. The phone had finally stopped its incessant ringing. The world had moved on to the next scandal. I was left with my notes, the copies of the letters, the sheet music for Elara's theme, and the audio file containing her voice. I was left with the real story. And so, I began to write. I didn't start with the discovery of the box, or the details of the crime. I started with a young, gifted composer arriving in Hollywood, full of dreams. I wrote about a brilliant young actress, trapped in a cage made of fame and gold. I wrote about their secret meetings, the music they shared, the gardenias that became their symbol. I wrote about their desperate, hopeful plan to escape and build a simple life together. The world would remember the murder, the scandal, the body in the hills. The world had the cold case. But I had the letters, the music, and the sound of a voice filled with love and defiance. I was going to write the love story. And in the title page of my manuscript, I typed the only 2 words that felt right. The only 2 words that truly mattered. Elara's theme. The case was closed. The files were put away. But for the first time in a very long time, as I sat in the quiet of my office, the city humming below, the room didn't feel haunted. It felt peaceful. And in that peace, if I listened closely, I could almost hear the music. Months passed. The firestorm of the Elara Vance case slowly burned down to embers, leaving behind a changed landscape. The Blackwood name was permanently tarnished. The foundation, under new management, quietly began its work funding the film preservation grant named for the woman its founder had murdered. Elara's grave at Hollywood Forever became a site of pilgrimage for film lovers. The world, as it always does, had processed the scandal and was moving on. My own life had found a new, quiet rhythm. I had severed ties with the frantic news cycle, unplugged my phone, and immersed myself in the past. My desk was no longer a war room of clues and theories, but a scholar's sanctuary. It was covered in the artifacts of a life, not a crime. Copies of Elara's letters, the sheet music for Julian's theme, detailed notes on silent film production. I was writing, and for the first time, it felt less like an investigation and more like a collaboration with a ghost. I was finally telling the story I had promised myself I would, the love story. The peace I felt was profound. I thought the story was complete, that all its secrets had been told. I was wrong. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. It was a simple, cream-colored envelope, addressed to me in elegant, old-fashioned cursive. It was not from a publisher or a lawyer. The return address was for a man I had never heard of, in Pasadena. I opened it with mild curiosity. "Dear Mr. Harding," it began. "My name is Dominic Valenti. My maternal grandmother was the actress Serafina Monroe. I have followed the recent revelations concerning the death of Elara Vance with great interest. You have done the world a service by bringing the truth of her tragic end to light. However, the story that has been told, while largely accurate, is incomplete. My grandmother, whom the world knew as Miss Vance's fiercest rival, was in fact her closest and most trusted friend. For her entire life, she kept a diary. In it, she detailed the truth of their friendship, and more importantly, a final secret that Miss Vance entrusted to her just days before she disappeared. A secret she was too terrified to ever reveal. I believe it is time for that final piece of the record to be set straight. If you are interested in the whole truth, I would be honored to meet with you." I read the letter twice, a jolt of electricity running through me. Serafina Monroe. The vamp, the rival. In every historical account, she was the villain of Elara's professional life, a jealous competitor. The idea that this was a studio-manufactured fiction, that they were secretly friends, was a staggering revelation. My first instinct was skepticism. The world now knew I was the keeper of Elara's story, and the cranks and opportunists had been circling for months. But this felt different. It was calm, articulate, and it asked for nothing. I spent the morning doing research. Serafina Monroe had married a European director after her career faded in the talkie era, had one daughter, who in turn had one son, Dominic Valenti, a respected professor of American history at Occidental College. He was real, and he was the grandson of the only other person who might have known Elara's state of mind in her final days. I agreed to meet him at a quiet cafe near his university. He was a man in his 50s, with his grandmother's sharp, intelligent eyes and the thoughtful, deliberate manner of a lifelong academic. He carried a small, leather-bound book with the reverence of a priest carrying a holy text. "Thank you for meeting me, Mr. Harding," he said. "My grandmother's public image was a source of great pain to her. The studio cast her as the villain, and she played the part, but in private, she and Elara were allies. They were two young women navigating a system run by predatory men. They protected each other." He opened the diary, its pages brittle with age. "My grandmother was supposed to be Elara's alibi on the night she vanished," he explained. "Elara was meant to be with Serafina, to throw off suspicion. When she never arrived, my grandmother knew something terrible had happened. She was questioned by the police, but she was too terrified of Blackwood to tell them the truth. She lived with that guilt for the rest of her life. Dominic turned to a page near the end of the book. The ink slightly faded. "This entry is from 2 days before the premiere," he said, his voice low. "I believe it contains the last secret of the case." He began to read aloud from his grandmother's diary. October 5th, 1928. E. was here this afternoon. She is a ghost. Her nerves are shredded. She is convinced SB suspects something. She fears he will find a way to stop her. The recording she placed in the bank box. She worries it won't be enough. He is a monster, but not a fool. She told me she has one final failsafe. She said, if he takes my life, I will make sure I take his empire. She gave me a key. A small, simple key for a parcel locker at Union Station. She told me it contains her real insurance. Not a personal confession, but his business ledgers. The real ones. The ones that show how he moves his money, how he evades his taxes, the crimes the government actually cares about. She said if the world couldn't give her justice for her life, the IRS would give her justice for his. I sat there, stunned into absolute silence. The case I thought I had closed was suddenly blown wide open again. Elara Vance was not just a victim who had planned an escape. She was a brilliant, courageous strategist. The recording was her emotional insurance, a plea for the truth. But this was a weapon. A dead man's switch designed to dismantle the Blackwood Empire from its financial foundations. She had a plan to hold him accountable for crimes far bigger than her own murder. My grandmother never knew what to do, Dominic said, his voice full of his family's inherited sorrow. She kept the key, a strange, silent heirloom. She was too frightened of Blackwood to ever go to the station herself. After he died, she was too old, and the trail was too cold. The key was passed to my mother, and then to me. We never knew what it was for. Until now. He reached into his briefcase and placed a small, tarnished brass key on the table between us. It was a simple parcel locker key, with the number 317 stamped into its head. I stared at it, my mind reeling. The story wasn't over. Elara Vance, from 90 years in the grave, had one final move to play, and she had just handed me the key. I left the cafe with the small, tarnished key in my pocket, feeling a charge I hadn't felt in months. The peaceful, reflective work of writing Elara's story was over, replaced by the familiar, addictive jolt of an active investigation. The case wasn't an epilogue anymore. It was a thriller with a final, unread chapter. Elara Vance was more brilliant and more daring than anyone had ever known. She hadn't just created an escape plan. She had forged a weapon of mutually assured destruction, and I was now its sole executor. The key felt heavy in my hand, a direct link to her final, defiant act. The first and most obvious step was to go to Union Station. But as I drove, a nagging piece of historical dissonance began to bother me. Union Station, the grand mission-style cathedral of Los Angeles Transit, was an icon of the city. It was also an icon that didn't exist in 1928. It wasn't open to the public until 1939. Elara and Serafina, living in the Los Angeles of the 1920s, would have never called it Union Station. The diary entry was Serafina's, written with the knowledge of a place that wouldn't exist for another 11 years. Dominic had mentioned his grandmother lived well into the 1980s. She must have written that specific entry much later in her life, transcribing an older, lost note. And in her memory, all the old, demolished train stations of Los Angeles had coalesced into the one grand station that survived, Union Station. It was a simple mistake of memory, but one that meant I was looking in the wrong place. The hunt was on again. Back in my office, I dove into the history of LA's railway system. In 1928, the city was served by several grand terminals. My research quickly narrowed the most likely candidate down to Central Station, the Southern Pacific's massive, ornate depot on Central Avenue. It was the city's primary east-west hub, a bustling gateway from which a person could disappear into the rest of the country. It was the perfect place for Elara to have stashed her final secret. The problem, of course, was that Central Station was a ghost. It had been torn down in 1956, its land swallowed up by the relentless expansion of the downtown freeway system. The building was gone. The lockers, presumably, were gone with it. For a moment, I felt the cold dread of a dead end. But I thought of the bank vaults. A corporation like a major railroad wouldn't just throw away the contents of a secure parcel locker. There had to be a protocol, a paper trail. I spent the next day on the phone, a frustrating journey into the past. I called the Union Pacific Railroad, who had absorbed Southern Pacific. I was met with a now familiar wall of corporate indifference. My breakthrough came, as it so often does, from a niche expert. I found a railroad historical society and was put in touch with a retired civil engineer named Frank Madsen, a man who had made the lost train stations of Los Angeles his life's passion. Central Station? Oh, she was a beauty, Frank said over the phone, his voice full of warmth and nostalgia. When they tore her down, it was a municipal tragedy. As for the lockers, you're right. The standard wooden ones were likely scrap, but the parcel rooms had these big, heavy-duty security lockers. Brass doors, high-end locks. They were built to last. What would have happened to them, Frank? I asked. Well, the railroad would have held them in storage for a period to handle any claims. After that, who knows? But the demolition was a city contract. The city would have taken possession of any unclaimed municipal assets from the site. If those lockers still exist, they're probably sitting in a dusty city warehouse somewhere, forgotten. He gave me a new direction, the Los Angeles Municipal Archives. Specifically, the records for the Department of Public Works, circa 1956. The paper chase was on again. I spent hours scrolling through scanned, digitized manifests, the digital equivalent of blowing dust off of forgotten boxes. And then, on page 217 of a transfer manifest from the Central Station demolition site, I found it. The entry was stark and clear. Item number 412, 1 unit, secure parcel lockers, brass, 50 count, from parcel room C. Transferred to City Archival Warehouse Annex B. My heart hammered against my ribs. They had survived. The entire bank of lockers had been moved as a single, heavy piece of forgotten history. My next search was for Warehouse Annex B. It still existed, a sprawling, low-slung building in the industrial flats near the LA River, a place where the city sent its old, surplus equipment to die. It was the city's attic. Now I had a new problem. I couldn't just walk into a secure city facility with a 90-year-old key and ask to start opening lockers. I needed official help. I needed a badge. I picked up my phone and called a number I had saved from the media frenzy a few months back. It was for a Detective Miller, a senior officer in the LAPD's cold case unit who had been the official point of contact on the Vance case. "Miller," he answered, his voice weary. "Detective, this is Jake Harding." There was a pause. "Mr. Harding." I'd hoped I was done hearing about this case. The press conferences were enough for one lifetime. "I understand, Detective," I said, "but I have a credible lead on new evidence. Evidence Elara Vance herself hid. I have the key, and I know where the lock is. It's in a city warehouse, and I need your help to get inside." I laid out the story of Serafina's diary and the trail of paperwork that led me to the warehouse. I could hear his skepticism warring with his cop's intuition. He was silent for a long time. "A city warehouse, you say?" he finally grunted. "This case just gets stranger." He let out a long sigh. "All right, Harding. You've been right about everything else so far. It's a long shot, but I'll bite. I'll get the clearance. Meet me at the Municipal Archives on Veen Street tomorrow morning. 9 a.m. Don't be late." He hung up. I sat back, the tarnished brass key in the palm of my hand. The station was a ghost, the railroad was a memory, and the trail was nearly 70 years cold. But the lock was real. And tomorrow, with the weight of the Los Angeles Police Department behind me, I was going to see if Elara Vance's final, most dangerous secret had survived the journey. The next morning, I met Detective Miller in the shadow of a building that was a perfect monument to forgotten things. The City Archival Warehouse Annex B was a vast, featureless structure of corrugated steel and stained concrete, hunkered down in a dusty industrial corner of the city near the river. It was the place where obsolete municipal property went to rust in peace. Miller was leaning against his unmarked sedan, nursing a cup of coffee. He was a tall, grizzled man in a rumpled suit, with the weary, cynical eyes of a cop who had seen too many stories end badly. He looked me up and down, his expression a perfect mask of professional skepticism. "Harding," he grunted, "you'd better not be wasting my time. I had to pull a lot of strings to get a supervisor to open this place up on a non-scheduled day." "I don't think you'll be disappointed, Detective," I said, holding up the small, tarnished key so it caught the morning light. A city foreman, a paunchy, balding man named Sal with a key ring that looked like it weighed 10 pounds, met us at a rolling steel door. He unlocked it with a groan of metal on metal and led us inside. The air in the warehouse was thick, cool, and smelled of dust, decaying paper, and the faint metallic scent of old oil. The space was cavernous, dimly lit by high, grimy windows. It was a labyrinth of forgotten city life. Mountains of obsolete office furniture, rows of silent, mechanical voting machines, pallets stacked with decommissioned street signs. It was a tomb of civic memory. Sal consulted a dusty, clipboard manifest. Yeah, I remember this thing. he mumbled, more to himself than to us. Came in with the teardown of the old PE building. We stuck it way in the back. Figured it was just scrap. He led us through the maze, our footsteps echoing in the vast space, until we reached a far, dark corner. And there it was. It was a magnificent, melancholy sight. A freestanding bank of 50 security lockers, built of heavy steel and faced with brass doors that had tarnished to a deep, mottled bronze. It was a solid 3-ton chunk of a world that no longer existed, sitting incongruously next to a stack of broken office chairs. A thick blanket of dust, undisturbed for what must have been decades, covered its entire surface. Well, I'll be, Miller said, his skepticism beginning to crack. He ran a hand over the dusty surface. They don't make 'em like this anymore. I walked along the bank, my heart pounding, wiping away the grime from the small, numbered plates until I found it. 317. The lock was dark with age, but it looked solid, inviolable. This was the spot. All right, Harding, Miller said, crossing his arms. This is your show. Let's see if that key is more than a souvenir. All the work, the research, the lucky breaks, and the desperate gambles had led to this single quiet moment. I stepped forward. The brass key felt cool and solid in my hand. I wiped the dust from the lock and slid the key into the opening. It was stiff at first, then slid home with a satisfying metallic whisper. I held my breath and turned. For a moment, there was nothing but resistance. The mechanism was frozen by time. I applied steady pressure, and then, with a sharp, shockingly loud click that echoed through the silent warehouse, the 90-year-old tumblers turned. I pulled the small, brass door open. The air that escaped was dry, stale, and smelled faintly of leather. The locker was not empty. Inside sat a single object, a handsome, dark leather document satchel, the kind a lawyer or a businessman might have carried in the 1920s. It was stiff and dry with age, but otherwise perfectly preserved. I carefully lifted the satchel out and placed it on a nearby dusty crate. Miller and Sal leaned in, their skepticism now completely replaced by rapt curiosity. The brass clasps on the satchel were stiff, but they opened. I lifted the flap. Inside were 2 thick, leather-bound accounting ledgers. But that wasn't all. Tucked alongside them was a thick sheaf of documents, tied with a faded ribbon. I carefully untied it. They were stock certificates and property deeds. I recognized the names on the deeds immediately. They were for several large, contiguous parcels of land in a dusty, agricultural area of Los Angeles County that was then known only as the San Fernando Valley. Miller let out a low whistle. That land, that's worth a fortune today. That's half of Encino. Elara hadn't just secured evidence. She had hit Blackwood where he lived. She had found his secret, off-the-books assets, the foundation of his personal wealth, and she had taken them. But the real treasure was the ledgers. I opened the first one. It was not like Manny Grossman's crude expense book. This was the real thing. Page after page was filled with meticulous, elegant script, detailing a complex web of shell corporations, offshore accounts, and illegal asset transfers. It was the secret financial blueprint of the Blackwood studio empire. It showed massive, systemic tax evasion, bribes to city officials, and illegal stock manipulation. It was the kind of hard, irrefutable evidence that would have not just destroyed Silas Blackwood's reputation, it would have sent him to federal prison for the rest of his life. This was what Elara meant. Not just justice for her, but the complete and utter annihilation of his entire empire. Detective Miller stared at the open page, his cynical cop's mask gone, replaced by an expression of pure professional awe. "My God, Harding," he said, his voice hushed. "This isn't a smoking gun. This is the entire damn arsenal. The DA's office, the IRS, they would have a field day with this. Even now." He carefully closed the ledger and looked at me, a new, hard light in his eyes. He was no longer just helping a writer with a historical curiosity. He was now an officer of the law in possession of evidence of massive, ongoing criminality. As the foundation of that wealth, the Blackwood Foundation itself, was still very much active. "The Blackwood Foundation thought they were done with you," Miller said, his voice a low growl. "They thought they'd managed the problem by throwing some money at a grant and admitting to a 90-year-old murder. They're about to find out the real story is just beginning." He looked from the satchel to me. "So, what do you want to do now, Harding?" he asked. "Because with this, you can burn that entire legacy to the ground. For good." Elara's final weapon wasn't just a key to a locker. It was the key to the utter destruction of the Blackwood dynasty. And Detective Miller had just handed it to me. We stood in the dusty silence of the city warehouse, the ghosts of 1,000 forgotten objects bearing witness. The leather satchel sat open on the crate, its contents a testament to a crime far greater than a single murder. This wasn't just the story of a woman's life being taken. It was the story of how a criminal empire was built, brick by illicit brick. Detective Miller's question hung in the air between us, heavy and sharp. What do you want to do now, Harding? The power in that question was absolute. With a single phone call to the press or the district attorney's office, I could unleash a firestorm that would obliterate the Blackwood Foundation, trigger federal investigations, and create a scandal that would make the previous revelations feel like a footnote. I could burn the entire legacy to the ground, just as Miller said. For a moment, I was tempted. The primal, Old Testament appeal of it was undeniable. An eye for an eye. A legacy for a life. To bring the entire corrupt dynasty crashing down in a blaze of public disgrace felt like the ultimate form of justice. But then I thought of Elara. I thought of her voice on the recording, her desperate wish not for revenge, but for a quiet life with the man she loved. I thought of her final message, a whisper of love, not of hate. Her weapon, this satchel full of dynamite, was a deterrent. It was the ultimate guarantee of her freedom, a bomb she had built but surely hoped she would never have to detonate. To use it for pure, chaotic destruction felt like a betrayal of her spirit. It felt like something Silas Blackwood himself would do. She didn't want to burn the world down, Detective, I said, my voice quiet but firm. She just wanted to be free from her corner of it. Unleashing this on the world feels wrong. It makes her a symbol of ruin. I think we can find a better form of justice. Miller looked at me, his expression unreadable, but he nodded slowly. It's your play, Harding. What's the move? My plan was simple. It was audacious. And it was final. The second phone call to Marcus Thorne was brief. There was no negotiation in my voice. I have the contents of Locker 317, I said. Tell Mr. Blackwood he will see me in 1 hour. This will be our last conversation. The second meeting in the Century City skyscraper was a mirror image of the first, but the atmosphere was entirely different. The calculated calm was gone, replaced by the raw, palpable stench of fear. Silas Blackwood III was not standing imperiously by the window. He was seated behind his massive desk, his face pale, his composure shattered. Marcus Thorne stood beside him, looking like a man who was about to witness an execution. I didn't speak. I walked to the desk and placed a single, brittle document on the polished wood. It was one of the property deeds from the Satchel, for a vast tract of land in what was now Encino, signed by Shell Corporation and countersigned by Silas Blackwood Sr. It was the source code of their family's immense wealth. Blackwood stared at it as if it were a venomous snake. What is this?" he stammered. "That is the original sin, Mr. Blackwood," I said, my voice cold. "And I have the ledgers that document all the others. Tax evasion, bribery, fraud on a scale that would make your grandfather one of the most significant white-collar criminals of his century. This isn't just a murder anymore. This is the whole rotten tree, from the roots up. The DA would love it. The IRS would be ecstatic." Blackwood slumped in his chair, a broken man. He knew there was no way to fight this. "I am here to give you a choice," I said. "It's not a negotiation. These are my terms. You will do this, or I will walk out of this office and hand-deliver this satchel to the U.S. Attorney's Office. And I will enjoy watching them dismantle everything you have ever known." I laid out my ultimatum. First, I began, the Blackwood Foundation, as it currently exists, will be voluntarily dissolved. Effective immediately. Thorne opened his mouth to protest, but Blackwood waved him into silence. Second, the entirety of the Foundation's assets, every last dollar of its endowment, will be transferred to a new, independent charitable trust. You and your family will have no control, no say, and no connection to it, forever. I let that sink in. I was demanding he give away his family's entire fortune. Third, this new entity will be named the Elara and Julian Foundation. I saw a flicker of genuine pain in Blackwood's eyes. I wasn't just taking his money, I was erasing his name and replacing it with the names of his grandfather's victims. Its mission, I continued, will be twofold. It will honor the original agreement to fund silent film preservation. And its primary purpose will be to provide funding for legal aid services and shelters for victims of domestic abuse and corporate harassment. The money your grandfather gained by abusing his power will now be used exclusively to protect those who have none. And finally, I said, delivering the last term, the ledgers and deeds will be placed in a secure, sealed archive under the control of the new Foundation's board. They will never be made public. They will exist only as a guarantee. Should you or any member of your family, now or ever, attempt to challenge this agreement, the contents of that archive will be delivered to the federal government. It is a sword that will hang over your family's name for eternity. I finished and stood in the silent, opulent office. It was total. It was absolute. It wasn't revenge. It was a forced atonement of a scale that was almost biblical. Silas Blackwood III looked smaller than I had ever seen him, a man drowning in the sins of his ancestor. There was no fight left in him. He looked at Thorn, his eyes hollow. "Do it," he whispered. "Do what he says." I turned and walked out of the office, leaving the ruins of a dynasty behind me. As I stepped into the elevator, I felt a lightness I had not felt since this all began. He had lost his name, his legacy, and his fortune, all without a single new headline being printed. It wasn't the loud, public execution the world might have wanted. It was something better. It was a quiet, permanent, and poetic justice. Elara Vance hadn't just taken his empire. Through me, she had transformed it. A year can be a lifetime. It's long enough for a media firestorm to become yesterday's news, for a dynasty to quietly crumble, and for the ghosts of the past to finally find their peace. The world at large remembers the story of the Silent Starlet as a shocking, historical scandal that erupted and then faded, as all such stories do. But I remember it as a quiet promise, finally kept. The Blackwood Foundation, as the world knew it, is gone. The news cycle reported it as a major philanthropic restructuring. A dry, financial story about a massive endowment being folded into a new, independent trust with a modernized, socially conscious mission. No one in the public knew that the entire multi-billion-dollar fortune had been severed from the Blackwood family forever, an act of silent, complete surrender. The new foundation, the Elara and Julian Foundation, is now one of the most significant charitable forces in the state. I sometimes see its name in the news. A grant that saves a classic silent film from crumbling into dust. A multi-million-dollar donation that keeps the lights on at a network of women's shelters across the city. Each act is a quiet, anonymous echo of Elara's final victory. The empire her abuser built on darkness is now, piece by piece, being used to create light. It is the most profound and perfect justice I could have ever imagined. My book, Elara's Theme, was published 6 months ago. It wasn't the sensational blockbuster the big New York publishers had wanted. It was a quiet book. It told the story of the murder, but it focused on the love story, on the quiet courage of a woman who refused to be owned, and on the decent man who offered her a chance at a real life. It was well received by critics, who praised its empathy. More importantly to me, I received a short, handwritten letter from Eleanor Peterson. She said I had captured her uncle's gentle soul perfectly. It's the only review I'll ever care about. I still keep in touch with the others who were touched by this story's long shadow. Rachel Weisz is traveling the world, using her small inheritance to see the places her father's dark money had kept her from appreciating. The burden of his secrets, now lifted, has made her light enough to fly. And every few months, I get a postcard from Palm Springs from Gloria Valenti, usually with a scathing, witty comment about modern Hollywood. The last one simply said, "Heard your book is good. Knew you had it in you, kid." Today, on the anniversary of the day they found her, I drove back to Griffith Park. The circus is long gone. The police tape, the news vans, the forensic teams, they are all just memories. I walked up the trail to the secluded ravine. It is wild and beautiful again. Nature, in its quiet, relentless way, has been healing the scar. Wildflowers now grow on the patch of earth that was, for so long, her tomb. I stood there for a long time, looking out over the sprawling, hazy expanse of Los Angeles. The city is a living, breathing archive of a million such stories, a million ghosts waiting for someone to listen. When I first found Al Fincher's box of notes, I was just a writer, a professional sifter of cold cases, drawn to the darkness of the past. But this case was different. It didn't just lead me to a killer. It led me to a love story that was stronger than death, more powerful than a corrupt empire, and more enduring than time itself. It taught me that justice isn't always about loud confessions and public disgrace. Sometimes, the most profound justice is quiet. It's the silent transfer of a fortune. It's a woman's name being put on a foundation that helps others. It's a final message of love, delivered 90 years too late, but not too late to matter. I came to this story looking for a forgotten crime. In the end, I found a love that refused to be forgotten. The city is full of ghosts, each with a tale to tell, each with a truth waiting in the silence. My job, I've learned, is not just to find the facts. My job is to listen. I turned to leave the ravine, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows through the trees. And as I walked back toward the bustling, living city, I could almost hear it on the wind, a faint, beautiful, and finally peaceful melody. Elara's Theme.